Hi, I am Matthew Worley. Today is October 4th, 2017. We're in Rancho Cucamonga, California. We're here with Spider Harrison. Also joining us off camera is Randy West.
Hello.
And we are all three members of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters.
Everyone should be.
Okay, we are here. Spider Harrison, thank you so much for allowing us to visit you and chat with you today.
Thank you so very much.
So, in beginning, just a couple of questions to establish. What was your full name at birth?
Bernard Harrison, Bernie. And I thought about that for a long time. Bernie is a cool name for television and movies. But Spider Harrison stuck with me in high school. And when I got into radio, nicknames and personality names were happening. So I said, I'll just be Spider Harrison. And everybody liked that.
So, you're from Hempstead, New York.
I was born and raised in Hempstead, Long Island, New York, right? Yeah.
Okay, so you're in the more or less New York metro, would we say?
I would say so, yeah, Long
Okay.
Island.
So, what were your first memories of television or radio?
Well, it was radio, really. And I always wanted to know what that man looked like on the radio. And I go back to the days of Arthur Godfrey, and then he was, and then some of the comedy shows, I Love Lucy, Amos and Andy, a lot of those type of radio shows. And music was really about jazz in New York. And then a guy by the name of Alan Freed came, and jazz just went away, and the young people would just stop listening to jazz because I was really into jazz when I was like 11, 12 years old. Symphony Sid,
Yeah.
I thought he was real cool. And then all of a sudden, Hound Dog, and then Alan Freed came, and everything changed. By the time I was 13 years old, jazz was gone and rock and roll was in, and everybody was a little Anthony or a little Richard, and the rest is history.
Okay, now, so you're into jazz. Now, and you say, well, you're a young person, you're listening to jazz, and the scene changes, and now it's rock and roll. Had you yet at that time formed the idea of wanting to be on radio?
I think so. I grew up listening to, like I said, Symphony Sid, and I called him up one time, and he answered the phone. And he says, what kind of music you like? And I told him everything. He said, I like people who like everything. He had this deep voice. I never will forget that. And then we had a landlord named Catherine Gay. She was a model, and she dated a guy by the name of Tommy Smalls, Dr. Jive. And so everybody would listen to Dr. Jive. It would come on like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I guess I was around 10, 11 years old. And that's when I probably knew that I wanted to be into radio. And then my father also was a bartender. He was a World War II vet, got out of the service, and so he was a bartender. And we used to see all the records on the jukeboxes. And he used to bring on all the used records and everything. So I said, hey, I want to do what those guys do on the radio. So I was really young when I was really exposed to the guy coming out of the box, that voice coming out of the box. That who is that? What does he look like? And I think Arthur Godfrey, you heard him and then you saw him. Then he became variety shows, and that's when television started. I was really young, but it kind of like got me into this is what I think I want to do. And I always thought I was a cute little guy. So I wanted to, be on television or in radio or sing, because everybody had doo-wop groups at that time. So it was something in the entertainment industry. And that personality probably came from my father, but my mother was a very good-looking woman. She was a cheerleader in high school, and, she was a pretty sharp lady.
So you mentioned the change of music. When you saw yourself as a young kid maybe wanting to be in radio, did you see yourself playing more like jazz-type music when the changeover happened in popular music, were you dispirited, no, I can't go play this kind of music on the radio because it's changed, or did you think about things like that?
Well, it was a combination of all of it because I was in school plays in grade school. Played the cowboys, a lot of cowboy music. Gene Autry was happening, Roy Rogers was happening. So a lot of cowboy music was going on. And we used to sing it. We used to act, Long Island, we would sing cowboy music and learn how to square dance and all that in the public school system. And I knew that I wanted to do something on stage, but it was a combination of the cowboys and Arthur Godfrey and watching the Lone Range and all that. It was a combination of television, Captain Video, and everything just like, evolved into wanting to be into the entertainment industry.
So you wanted to be involved in entertainment, and radio was just one pathway into that door.
Right. I saw then that they were all cousins.
Yeah.
Radio, television, the motion picture industry. Doo-wop groups were happening. I was in a doo-wop group. Frankie Lyman was 13 years old. You know, he was happening, and he really, really did it. I mean, the Jackson 5 came along much later. But Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers really grabbed everybody. And then we used to go to the Apollo Theater. My mother, I think I was going to the Apollo Theater in 1954. I was that young. So I had a chance to see Count Basie and Cab Calloway and all those artists, you know, then the doo-wop groups. And I had a talk with Jim Brown about that one time. I did an interview with Jim Brown.
The football star, Jim Brown?
Jim Brown, the football player. He lived in Hempstead, Long Island. He's from Manhasset, the North Shore. And I lived, you know, Hempstead is in the South Shore. But he had a girlfriend who lived in Hempstead also, and we talked about that. Then he didn't want to talk about the past, and at the end of the interview, he said, yeah, so you know where I live at now, come on up to Hollywood and see me sometime. But we talked about the Apollo Theater, and he said that was our culture. Now, we could have went to Broadway. We could have went to Broadway plays when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. But the Apollo Theater was the thing to go to. I mean, even Elvis and everybody else went there. I mean, that's, you know, to have seen Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley in their prime and they like 23, 22 years old, it stays in your mind forever, you know? And sometimes I wish I was back in New York. I still love New York, you know, and every time I do, I ride past the Apollo Theater. I go to the airport, I see my friends, and I get in a rental car and I go past the Apollo Theater. You know, it's a historical thing. It stays into your memory bank. You know, you're part of it. It's your life, you know?
So at what point do you have your first acquaintanceship with anything professional in the entertainment business?
It was in high school, and we were background singers for a guy named Nicky Zan. And his father was an executive with Ideal Toys at the time who lived in Bayside or Little Neck, that part of Queens. And there was a promoter by the name of Troy Stevens who always wanted me to hang out with him. He was 22, 23 years old. And he says, hey, I want you guys to come with me. Bell Sound Studios was happening. Now, I'm a sophomore in high school, okay? And he wanted some background singers, and the song was called Southern Belle. And it was three guys, a guy named, it was one girl and another guy. He lives in North Carolina, and she passed away, Jean. And we were background singers, Southern Belle, you know. And we didn't get paid. The guy didn't pay us. You know, that was the thing, you know.
You're learning fast.
And this is Bell Sound Studio in Manhattan. This is where Johnny Mathis recorded. They used to call it Mr. One Take because he would go in and do a song. And also Don Costa, I remember his name coming up.
The famous arranger.
Right. But Bell Sound was a studio, and a guy who worked with the Drifters, he produced a song called Southern Belle. And the artist's name was Nicky Zan. And that was the first professional field. But I said, I ain't get no money. But then Troy Stevens also was a promoter. And that's when I met Frankie Avalon. And he was an African-American guy, 22, 23 years old, but his parents also backed him. And he had Frankie Avalon and the Skyliners. They all came to a place called Island Garden Arena. A guy named Whitey Carson owned it in West Hempstead, Long Island. And I remember somebody saying, hey, Frankie, this colored guy is promoting this show. And Frankie Avalon said, can he pay us? And he said, yeah. He said, well, Frankie said, I'm going to do the show. And that was it. And I mean, you know, so it wasn't about, that's how people talk then, you know. Used to say, hey, that guy's a German guy, that guy's an Irish guy. New Yorkers talked that way back then, you know. It was nothing racist, it was just the way people talked, you know. And then things changed as people got older, you know. And so that was my first professional, especially I can make money at this. Can I make money at this?
Well,
and then...
how did you reach that point of being actually hired to be even though you weren't paid, leaving that part out of it, how did you reach the point of being good enough to be hired as a background singer?
Well, college. I had a brother killed in Vietnam, and I was like 21 years old, and that's when I started taking things real serious. But then I remember meeting Babalu at WABC when I was with this promoter doing shows, Little Anthony and Perry's up in New Haven, Connecticut, and Babalu said, why don't you answer the phone for me? I got to rate some records. So I was rated the records, and I said, hey, I like this. I was picking up, talking to these kids in New Haven, Connecticut. And I knew then that's when I really had the bug. that I could do something in radio. And Bob Lou was just a nice guy. You know, he drove an Austin Healey, I remember, and he went on at nights. And he told the promoter, he says, hey, my watch is going to go off, wake me up because I got to go on air at midnight. And I was right there and I saw all this, you know. And then that's when he said, I need somebody to answer the phones for me. And Bob Lou pointed to me. He says, answer the phones for me. And just I'm rating records. I never will forget that. And the next thing I knew, Bob Lou was on ABC, WABC. So at that time, I knew then that I was going to, I wanted to be into radio. And then what happened was, after my brother got killed in Vietnam, I decided to get married young because everybody was either going to Canada, getting married, or getting drafted. And the guys who came back, or they didn't come back, came back messed up, you know. And there was a lot of protesting going on at that time. You know, there was a lot of rock stars. Everybody was protesting, you know, and the guys were coming back. People were spitting on them and didn't like them, you know, and I couldn't understand that, you know. And then I remember Woodstock was getting ready to happen, and I was working, interning at WWRL. And I got my job at WTOC in Indianapolis the weekend that they were having Woodstock.
68?
Yeah, 1968, 69.
Well, let's back up a bit. Is your first time on radio, on air, is this in college, at your college station?
I would say WCWP was the radio station that I got most of my experience.
And that's a college station, right?
That's a college station.
Okay.
That's having their reunion in 2 weeks, and I have 2 shows they're going to air.
Oh.
Four Tops and the Temptations, anyway.
So tell us, how did you end up at this particular college? Did you go there specifically because of media? Why did you go there? And how did you get involved in college radio?
Yeah, I knew that I wanted to go to Hofstra, but I didn't have, you know, the grades to go to Hofstra. That was a big school now, you know. But a guy, a basketball player by the name of Frank Townsend was dating a girl that I knew, and Frank Townsend was a heck of a basketball player. And he said, you know, C.W. Post College has a radio station. And I says, oh, yeah, okay. So, and I started taking classes at the school, and you had to take classes to go. So I said, and I liked the classes, you know, it was good for me, speech and English. And then I met the people at the radio station. One guy was Bill Moser. He was the chief engineer. He's there to this very day. And he said, you got to get yourself a third-class endorsement license. And I did that, and that means you had to read the meters and all. And I remember taking the exam down in Washington Park at the FCC office. And ran through the park, took the exam. And at that time, they would tell you if you passed, you know, he said, hey, yeah, you passed, you know, the endorsement. And I took that back out to CW Post College, and then they gave me a shift. And then I started doing news, and I started loving news. I said, maybe I want to do news. You know, news was good, and the roundup and how that was all formatted. And then I would go play records, and it was classical music. It was a little jazz music. Then they let me create a show called An Introduction to Soul. And one of my first interviews was with Sam and Dave. And then there was a television show on Channel 13 in New York, a guy by the name of Ellis Hazlip. And the show was called Soul. And that's when the first time I met Earth, Wind, and Fire. They were getting started around the same time. Although I had met Maurice White when he was I had met him later, though. He was with Ramsey Lewis.
So you mentioned like you interviewed Sam and Dave. Did you like do interviews when these people came to town, or did you do them on the phone, or what?
Yeah, well, because I was interning at WWRL, I would bring the jocks out to different nightclubs on Long Island. I was their little promoter. I was like the gopher.
Now this is while you're still in college.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I was
still
in school.
working at the college
Right.
station.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was working at this college station, and I was interning at WWRL, and I was working full time with Remington Electric Shavers, Spurry Rand Corporation at the time, in Garden City, Long Island.
Working full time doing what?
Fixing shavers, electric shavers.
Okay.
And I did seminars, and I got real good at it. And a guy by the name of Al Lane told me one time, he was from Hicksville, Long Island. He says, did you finish high school? I said, yeah. He says, you speak well. He said, what are you going to do? I didn't know if I wanted to go in the Marine Corps, get married. I was going through all this stuff, you know, at that time, because I didn't know what I really wanted to do. In high school, you learn how to type, which was good, you know, because I could still type, you know, the home row keys and all that. So you would have, either you were taking business classes or college classes in Hempstead High School. And if you're going to go to college, then you're talking taking languages and Spanish and algebra. And I says I'm going to do business. So it was business and typing and the manual typewriters and
Sure.
everything. And then the electric typewriters came on and all the office machines. So
So
I guess I was. Then you learn a little shorthand. So that was so long ago. I'm having a hard time almost remembering. Maybe I don't want to remember that. So
S-
long ago.
So your first internship while you're still in college is at WWRL, is that correct?
WWRL, and I became friends with some of the disc jockeys there.
Okay.
And
As an intern, what were you doing more or less?
Well, I learned how to do production because everything was analog. And then they said, why don't you do some gospel remotes where we can pay you on the weekends? So on the weekends, I would get in my old raggedy car from Hempstead, Long Island, and there were no brakes. I had to use emergency brake to stop it to pay the 10-cent toll at that time. Go to Woodside, Queens, and pick up their equipment. Then I would go to Brooklyn to a church and set up. And then I would take it down. Then I would go up on 124th Street to another church, and then another side of Brooklyn. Then go back to Queens, and that was all on Sundays. So I would go to Brooklyn, Queens, Brooklyn to Harlem, back to Queens, to turn the equipment, and then ride back out to Long Island. So I did that part-time as a fill-in, and that was my first paycheck from a radio station, a commercial radio station.
Were
doing
you
gospel.
using like a Marty unit? What were the remotes like in those days? How were they done?
They were portable. You would have, it was everything. The telephone lines came in,
So it was done by phone line.
phone line, right?
Okay.
And it wasn't, I can't think of the expressions now, but it sounded real clear on the radio.
Equalized line.
Equalized lines, right?
Yeah.
And every church had one, and you would take the remote and plug it into the lines, and then the church, the choirs would start singing, and you says, "You're on," and it's 1, 2, it was great. And outside of every church, there was always some record promoter, some record producer, because they would go to the churches to try to find these people, these great artists, like Aretha Franklin, all of them. A lot of them came out of the church, and they were always. I never will forget, how aggressive they were, and a lot of the kids and the preachers would chase the promoters away. Leave them alone. They don't want to go secular. They want to stay in the church.
Mhm.
But I saw that. But a lot of people started in church. I went to Catholic school, so it was, we didn't really sing, but in high school I sung, and I wanted to be a little singer too at one time.
Well, now you mentioned an introduction to soul, that you did a show called Introduction to Soul. I think you could speak to it better than I, but I think those who study music and things would say that soul music has, amongst its roots, it has a root in gospel music, along with, and I guess maybe part R&B and part other things. You could speak to that better than I could. Why did soul music specifically become of interest to you, that you wanted to do that on the radio versus jazz or versus R&B or something like that?
Well, college radio stations, FM stations at the time, was really educational, and Sam and Dave was from Memphis. So they were at the Apollo Theater, and then the jocks would take them to do gigs like in Newark, New Jersey. And I would go over and do an interview with them, and then on a cassette, and then air it on the radio. But nobody was really doing anything on WCWP soul related at that time, or R&B. And I saw an education for people to grab that. And what happened is I was spending so much time at that radio station. And one night I got locked into the radio station. I was editing, and I saw a magazine called Broadcasting, and they talked about an FM radio station in Indianapolis owned by a black doctor, a guy named Frank Lloyd. And he was very big, very popular, very, very popular doctor in Indianapolis, worked with Eli Lilly's and all that. And he bought this radio station, but he had investors, so local guys, and I picked up the phone one time and I just called the radio station, and I kept calling the radio station. And then by me being able to go on the air at WWRL as a guest DJ, I was able to go and edit that out at C.W. Post College and edit my voice, and they heard the jingles and me, and the owner of the station heard it in Indianapolis and he called me up and says, "Hey, maybe you want to come to Indianapolis." And so I says, well, Remington Electric Shavers had a station also. They were all over the country at that time. So I used Remington. I went to Remington and says, "Can I get a transfer part-time to go to Indianapolis. And they says, yes, you can, because I did such a great job on Madison Avenue and in Garden City. And they knew I had a young family, and they says, yeah, you can transfer, and if it works out for you, if it don't work out for you, you can come back to Remington. And that came out of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Those guys out of Bridgeport, Connecticut made that happen for me.
So you had a radio gig and also a backup gig when
Just
you
in
went to
case.
this city. That's great.
Yeah.
One thing before we move on, I read in looking up information on you that you had, did I understand correctly, you had also interned at WABC.
Well, I say that through Chuck Leonard.
Tell
Chuck,
us about that.
Yeah, Chuck Leonard was from Chicago who worked at WWRL, and it was a big thing that, WABC was bringing in a black disc jockey. It was all over New York. I mean, nobody really cared. It was the fact that everybody was happy that Chuck Leonard was going to be on WABC, and he followed Cousin Brucey. And so I hung out with him a lot, and that was my intern way of ABC. I was able to go up to the station and watch Cousin Brucey come off the air every now and then, and Chuck Leonard. They all had engineers back in those days. Mm-hmm. So that was my degree of internship at WABC. I didn't get any college credits for it or anything like that.
You were able to hang around and observe.
Right.
Observe. We were talking about WABC earlier. Do you have anything on WABC you'd like to ask Randy about people he may have known there?
Well, when Rick Sklar hired a black disc jockey, it was the talk of the town. Did Chuck ever talk about adapting his act for WABC as opposed to WWRL, that was a soul station and his delivery was probably far more ethnic?
Yeah. One of the things that Chuck Leonard told me, he says, play it all. Play all the music. He said, if you're going to play R&B, learn rock also. The Loving Spoonful, just do it all. The Beatles, be able to do it all. Classical music, just learn it all. And that's why I do voice tracks now for a station in Nashville, top 40. Play everything from the Beatles to Barry White. And at that time in Nashville, they were looking for somebody with that knowledge. But I would say Chuck Leonard was one of the guys who instilled that into me. But then jingles were starting to be used on soul stations across the country. And a lot of the DJs, young black DJs across the country in New York, and they were sounding top 40. It was, and then FM radio was taken over because you can go through the Midtown Tunnel and listen to FM radio. The AM stations would just go out, And so slowly I was making that transition into radio, but it was AM radio still going on. And FM it was being experimented, really, by Drake. I think Drake was one of the people who had a format in New York, and it was, the music started changing a little bit. But I was so into the R&B and the AM stations, and then never heard soul music on an FM station until I went to Indianapolis. And at that time, they didn't really have a lot of FM radios in cars. You had to have an adapter, and adapters were selling like crazy. Then we started showing up in the ratings, and I think in the early 70s, they made it a law that you got to manufacture cars now with FM and AM. I think it became a law through the FCC. And then everybody started listening to FM radio, and I remember WIFE and all the big stations in Indianapolis says, if there's one guy got it made in this town, it's Spider Harrison. I was bringing all the shows in, all the artists from Chicago, the Shy-Lights, and they let me do it. I owned a record shop. I had 2 record shops, but I wasn't doing anything illegal. I didn't get involved with payola. I stayed away from that because I was the owners of the station. They let me do things as long as I didn't sell promotional copied records. So I did everything right, and I paid my taxes. And I think that's what happened to Alan Freed. He didn't pay his taxes because there were people who were making a lot of money who paid their taxes. And then he really did something that the people didn't like, He was bringing a new sound in New York, and people didn't really like that. But I think if Alan Freed had paid his taxes and not lied, he probably wouldn't have went through what he went through.
Anything else on ABC? No. You've raised an interesting point, which is, as a young person listening to radio, any of us who started in broadcasting, we begin by emulating people we've listened to, and then later in some mystical way we find our own sound or our own style. In listening to radio as a kid and then starting in radio, did you have as your heroes people who had a more, what we might call black sound, or a more we might call mainstream sound? Did you think when you were starting, did you think about I want to sound a certain way or I want to sound another way or?
Well, it was called contemporary. You know, I'm from Long Island. I was born and raised there. My kindergarten school teacher was Jewish. You know, I remember all my school teachers, and you just act the way that people that you were around. And everybody like talked the same way. So if somebody when I heard somebody like a Pat Boone cover a Little Richard song, I took it as a compliment because more people heard it. And the Moonglows, I used to watch the sisters. Can't think of their names right now. They were always on Arthur Godfrey singing "Sincerely" by the Moonglows. Gee whiz, I shouldn't have brought that up. 'Cause I can't
Well,
remember their
sincerely
name.
was the McGuire sisters.
McGuire
wasn't it?
sisters.
Yeah.
I used to love to watch Arthur Godfrey because I would hear that song sung by the McGuire sisters, which was a compliment to me because I loved this. It was a song I was into, but I was able to go to the Apollo and see the Moonglows sing it also. So coming from Long Island, I didn't think it was a copycat or something. It was a bad thing. I looked at it as a compliment, just like the Beatles covered a lot of songs for the Isley Brothers, Twist and Shout, because they knew that they could take some of those songs to the mainstream.
Maybe I want to clarify. Maybe the question may not be clear. It was as a presenter on radio, as a disc jockey. You know, there were some guys who played R&B, and they adopted a certain sound that was more an R&B type delivery and less of a mainstream pop type delivery as the disc jockey. And there were some guys who didn't do that. So I guess I'm saying, when you were thinking about becoming a disc jockey, did you think I wanted to have more of a black type sound or more of a pop-oriented type delivery or middle of the road type delivery?
Right. I wanted the rhythm to go, and that's why it's working now. I can play Bachman Turner Overdrive with R&B expressions and R&B rhythm, but my articulation sounds, they don't know whether I'm black or white. I mean, they do now because I just do my thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I knew it was a combination of all of that, you know, if that makes any sense.
At WWRL, you had Frankie Crocker doing a very specialized, a Soul Patrol.
Right.
You know, not mainstream. When Chuck moved from RL to ABC, he must have had to adapt his act, and likewise with Walt Baby Love at WOR FM.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on, which direction to take? You learned at WWRL, but you also heard from Chuck that you need to be mainstream.
Yeah, the top 40 was the key. You know, the sound top 40. I would say that. I enjoyed Tommy Small. Dr. Jive was just real smooth. Jocko was more personality. Okay, Frankie Crocker was just articulate. He was from Buffalo. He had a lot of rhythm and rhyme, but a lot of people didn't know if he was black or not. You know, and he went to WMCA for a while, and then you couldn't tell at one time. And Chuck Leonard became top 40 all the way because that's what ABC was at that time. So he became very contemporary, and he sounded more like a white disc jockey than a lot of the white disc jockeys at that time, you know. If that's clear, am I clear with that?
I think that's what we were trying to kind of get a sense of. Now, WTLC Indianapolis, you end up as PD there, is that right?
Right, as program director, right, because I knew the format clocks, and I knew that radio was going in that direction. And when I went there was a top 40 guy who was one of the owners. They had like 7, 8 owners. And he named it, Tom Mathis, he called it WTLC, 10 to 11 Care, which is still around today. And one of the kids who used to listen to me was Babyface, and that's why the group TLC came from that whole idea, with his production out of Atlanta. But I knew the format. I knew top 40 format, and I learned a lot of that from C.W. Post College. And I would write a clock, and I would show everybody what to do, and with the top 3 in the road, and the clocks were nice. They liked the clocks. And then I would do R&B, but I would do it top 40 style. And people would compliment me, say, you can work in any city. People would say that to me. So
So
I didn't
was
sound like a R&B jock, like in the South. They were more Southern
yeah.
in the South than they were in the Midwest or in the northern markets. And out here in L.A., it was a combination of both. With the magnificent Monty Q, he had came from the old school with the Burn Baby Burn thing, you know. And then they had a different kind of style, and a lot of the jocks from New York came to California and didn't do well because there's so many different I don't know, so many different demographics. Well, there's a lot of demographics in New York also. But KGFJ was a station out here in California, and I did work there for a short while. And then that's when I created a show called Whatever Happened To. I hope I'm not jumping over the years.
We're
here.
jumping a little bit, so let's talk about WTLC a little more. You went there, and the format at that time was top 40 or was R&B?
It was R&B. It was a classical station,
Okay.
and everybody had seen that FM had clean sound. Okay, and so FM radio station, that was one of the premier FM radio stations in the country. And after that, shortly after, then WBLS in New York, but AM radio was still strong right up until the 80s.
So you're trying to take the FM and begin to put it into play as a commercial force and in the market with playing R&B.
Right, and the ratings came out, and that's when the owner came to me, one of the owners came to me and says, I think you can say goodbye to Remington Shavers, because I was working for them part-time in the mornings, and I would come to the station in the afternoons. And then they made me program director, and he says, you can say goodbye to Remington. So I called Remington up and says, well, I got a full-time job in radio, this is it. And that was in 1969.
So this is your first full-time broadcasting gig at that point.
Right.
How did you feel finally after working toward this, doing part-time jobs, you've moved around the country? How did you feel when you finally you were making it work, really?
Felt real good. I would go to conventions. People knew who I was. Billboard magazine. I'm in Billboard magazine with Herbie Mann, and they really promoted me, and they really promoted FM radio. And when I went back to New York, all the guys were real proud. Even Chuck Leonard, he was just glowing, like he was. I can't believe it, that you used to hang around radio stations and now you're doing it. And then then the owners would promote me. So I felt good because I was getting insurance. I could pay my bills, I could do concerts, and I knew that I could do it not just in that market. I said eventually I can go back to New York, which was really the plan. And then WLAC opened up when John R. retired, and WLAC 28 states at nights, half of Canada, the Caribbean. I mean, I've gone to Antigua and people knew who I was.
Well, let's talk about that. But before we go there, let me ask you one thing, which is you mentioned casually, as an aside a moment ago, having a family. You mentioned having a family that moved with you to Indianapolis. I guess you had a wife at that time.
Yeah.
So what was having a young, growing family, and being a disc jockey is kind of an itinerant job sometimes. You move around markets. Was your wife and your kids, were they supportive of Dad trying to hop around and achieve things?
Well, the kids were so young.
Yeah.
My wife was very, very brilliant, smart. She worked at banks. She worked for Metropolitan Life. And she was the kind of person you come home, you give your paycheck to because everything's going to be taken care of. Back in the day, that day.
Yeah.
She didn't really want to leave New York, but she says, I'm going to support you because I see all the time that you're putting into and everything. And when I went there for 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, there was a guy named Roger Holloway who helped me out to find a nice apartment. And it was right on Pennsylvania Avenue in a real classy section of Indianapolis. And when I met her at the airport and she saw the place, she couldn't believe it. And then she heard me on the radio. She just kept looking at me. She says, you really, and then one day I was in New York, we lived in an apartment and I was practicing. And she says, was that you? She couldn't believe it was me practicing because I used to, do it in the bathroom and just imitate like I'm on the radio. And then one day I was almost crying. I says, I'm never going to get a job because I went to Stratford, Connecticut. I was sending tapes out, And then one day I got a call from Indianapolis, and Tom Mathis says, you've been calling me. We've been talking. And he says, how would you like to come to Indianapolis? I couldn't believe it.
Well, you mentioned finding the ad for this job in Broadcasting Magazine, which is the way a lot of guys, later it was called Broadcasting and Cable, a lot of guys got their jobs that way. How long were you looking, and how many ads do you think you responded to? And
Well, it was that night I got locked into the station. You know, it was like the supreme being put this book in my hand. I'm waiting for the security guards to let me out of the station because they had a lot of security. And if you didn't come out at a certain time, they would lock up, and then you were there until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning till the security guys come back and let you out. And I was looking at a magazine called Broadcasting Magazine. I'd heard about it, and I just kept reading it, and I saw something about WTLC.
But when you had tried to get jobs before, where did you find the jobs then?
Well, it was. I think I knew about broadcasting. I knew. Yeah, it was. I did know about broadcasting, and I saw a copy of it in the radio station. And then everybody who came to New York came from Buffalo, and my grandmother was living in Buffalo, New York at the time. Or Chuck Bennett had came from Chicago, some parts of Illinois, Pittsburgh. So I knew about, or Washington, D.C., so I knew about those stations through the guys at WWRL. I mean, New York is the #1 market in the country, you know, so everybody come to New York. And I got to know them and where they came from. And they said they all started in a smaller market, you know. And Buffalo I was really trying to go to Buffalo because my grandmother was there, and it was a WUFO. And I didn't get that job, and WTLC came through.
Anything on any of this? So how many years were you at WTLC?
I was there 5 years, and you know, somebody had told me that the average life of a disc jockey in the market was 5 years, and then either the kids grow up, they move, like 1/3 of a zip code changes every 5 years, you know, so the lifespan of a disc jockey was 5 years. This is what I was told, and I believed it, you know, and I was there exactly 5 years. And then one day I got a phone call, and that's when they said John Richburg is retiring, and all those artists I used to see at the Apollo Theater, you know, from Stax Records, they all got their start either out of Memphis or WLAC. Randy's, even Pat Boone got his start in Nashville, and he knew. And when I saw Pat Boone at the Marilyn McCoo and Billy Davis luncheon, I mentioned Randy Wood. And Pat Boone says, Randy Wood, you know, just like that. And that's where, I mean, I could have had a longer conversation with him, but it was, he was there supporting Marilyn and Billy. But I could have had a much longer conversation with Pat Boone because I know that he had just sold his house in Nashville a couple of years ago. And I could talk to him about Gene Noble, who did the show, and Randy Wood. And Randy Wood's son, John, lives in L.A. now, you know.
Randy Wood of Ranwood Records later.
Right. Well, it was Dot Records.
Dot originally, yeah.
Yeah, and he had a radio show on WLAC called Randy's that you can hear all over. And it's amazing. If you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you go there, the three guys, John R., Hoss Allen, and Gene Noble, you go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, it says, this is dedicated to the one I love. And you see a picture of those three guys. But because I took John R.'s place, they were talking about maybe putting my picture there because I replaced John R. And they wanted an African-American guy who could play rock music because Life and Casualty Insurance Company owned the station, and they wanted to go rock and roll. And eventually they got out of the business, and Billboard magazine bought the station.
Well, let's talk about this transition. You said, I got the call. Let's don't toss it away too much. How did you first become, what was the first contact between WLAC and you in Indianapolis? Did you make that contact? How did this all evolve?
Well, the disc jockeys at WLAC all were in the record business, but they were protected. You know, they were getting. What happened? Randy Wood bought the time, and he would hire these people, and the station would. So in other words, Randy was buying the time, the block times, half-hour shows, and a lot of new records were coming in through Randy's Record Mart for the first time, and people in the rural areas, it was a Class A station. It was like 10 of them in the country, and WLAC was one of them. And WSM was playing country and western, the Grand Ole Opry, in the same city, Nashville. And it was the disc jockeys that got to know Hoss Allen and John R. and their promotion guys. Like Joe Simon was an artist who became pretty big with Choking Kind and Drowning in the Sea of Love. And the artist was promoting their records. So they would go to Louisville and Indianapolis. So I got to know Joe Simon and all these guys well, and I would put the records on. They go back to John R. and tell him, says, this guy Spider Harrison in Indianapolis, he don't give us no problems. He played the records, you know, Freddie North, Nashville Records. He just played the records. And I became friends with them because the records were good, and I played the records, and they would go back. And then when it was time for John R to retire, Horace Allen said, there's only one guy fit into the family. And that's like 25 guys applied for the position. They said there's a guy named Spider Harrison in Indianapolis. And I went to Nashville and met Jim Ward, whose father, who had owned WLAC back in the 20s, who put the station on the air. And Jim Ward had became the general manager. And this is early 70s, 73. And I asked him one time, I says, why'd you hire me? He said, you look like you played the part. You know, I had on my white bucks, white shoes, and, you know, sports jacket, and shady glasses, little fro.
Mhm.
And they said that you look like you played the part, you know. And then I didn't have a problem. They said we were looking for somebody who can relate to the black kids and the white kids in the Nashville market and surrounding, in the suburbs. And because I'm from Hempstead, Long Island, I ain't having problems with anybody, you know. And everybody was surprised. And the kids, there are people there now in their 50s, the baby boomers, that when I was inducted into the Tennessee Radio Hall of Fame, was in high school, in junior high school, used to listen to me. And when I go back now, it's, you know, it feels good. And someone would say stuff that I used to say, and I look at him, this guy's 56 years old, and he remembered me when he was in high school. So that you know, that was a good feeling.
Yeah.
But I would say Long Island, growing up in Long Island, I would say, you know, Catholicism, going to catechism, going to confession, gave me a conscience because there was two sides of New York. I had to fight too, you know, I had to, especially when we lived in Elmont, Long Island. Elmont for a while, that was near Belmont Racetrack. And it was the good guys and it was the rough guys. And I had some issues. I had some problems when I was 13. And somebody turned my head around. And then, but when I put on that football uniform, that did it. When a guy named Todd Beck, he was Irish, he smoked cigarettes. He was an Irish coach, and his name was Todd Beck. He says, get in there in the backfield and run a 23 dive. And I shot through that hole so fast, he said, my God, who is that? He runs like a spider. And that was it. And then we huddled up again. He says, all right, let's run the same play. And I did the same play again. And then, 28 pitch out, had skinny legs, and nobody could catch me. And then by the time I was a senior, they said, well, Harrison can get through those holes, you know. Then I got hit, I got hurt. And we would scrimmage against teams like Thomas Jefferson in Brooklyn. They would come out to Long Island and scrimmage. And they would say, what happened to that guy Spider? You know, I would hear him talking, you know. But I was a small guy, and these guys started getting big. But I kept the name Spider throughout high school, and then working with promoters on the side. And I said, when I get in radio, I'm going to be Spider Harrison. And one time, Frankie Crocker did not want to get on the subway because he was going to a gig, you know, in a white suit. So he said, man, why don't you drop me off downtown? I said, okay. So he started talking to me. He said, your name is going to be Spider, and when you get in radio? I said, yeah. I remember telling him that, you know. Mm. And he just listened. He was pretty nice. Yeah. And I dropped him off, you know.
Well, WLAC, what you've basically established is that they sort of came to you and that they felt you were a good fit for what they were doing.
Right.
When the idea comes up to go to Nashville, to work a 50 kilowatt clear channel, to succeed someone who's a very well-known personality, how did you feel about all that?
Oh, gee whiz. Well, my wife didn't want to go. My first wife did not want to go.
And she's the one who also didn't really want to leave New York in the first place, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And probably got married too young. You know, we were both young, but friends. You know, our mothers were friends and everything. And my son was only 2 years old, and my daughter was going into first grade. She's oldest. And they kind of like grew up in Indianapolis, and because my daughter went to Indiana University and my son went to Indiana, both kids turned out to be good kids. I'm pretty lucky there, you know. And it was, I think Flip Wilson even sent a telegram to the station congratulating me, because a lot of these people grew up listening to WLAC, Randy's, even Morgan Freeman, although he won't say anything about it now. But I mean, everybody's listening to Randy's at nights because that was the station. It was, you know, the government didn't want to have the rural areas without any communication after World War II, so they let these Class A stations come into existence, and WLAC was one of them. And the format was who was targeting the African American community, and Gene Noble probably started it by accident. He was playing some big band music by Cap Calloway or somebody, and the students at Fisk University was calling the radio station. And that's when they knew something was happening, and it was Randy Wood's wife said, maybe you should call the radio station and talk to them. And Randy Wood had an appliance store. He had came out of the military and wasn't thinking about records. And his wife says, why don't you follow up on that? And he did, and he bought some time, and he bought 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and Gene Noble was the first one. And he had came out of the carnival, and Gene Noble became pretty popular. It's Randy's record mark. And that started something, and then that's when Randy Wood started Dot Records.
Well, let's just to make sure we get a little off topic here. I asked you how you felt about going to Nashville, and you said the first thing you said was, "My wife didn't want to go." How did you work all that out?
Well, she didn't want to go, and we were going in different directions. And the kids went back to New York because my mother was there, and my parents were there, and her mother was there. And we decided that the marriage wasn't going to work. But one of the things, she became a Catholic to marry me. And one of the things that I did is that I went to talk to a priest at St. Rita's in Indianapolis. And we talked to the priest, and I saw her, the way she crossed her legs, because she got, I was making money, and things started changing, And I wasn't an angel, but I was still bringing all my money home and taking care of the family and whatnot. And I noticed that she was changing. And she decided that she didn't want to, she was hanging out with a lot of older women, and they were like society women, their husbands had businesses, and they were drinking Hennessy every day. And I had a record shop that was doing pretty good.
In Indianapolis?
Yeah, they let me open up a record shop.
We've left something out here. You owned a record shop, or you managed one? Or, okay.
Yeah, Spider's Record, yeah. It was near, I can't think the name of that college. Not Ball State, that was in Muncie. But it was in the northern part of Indianapolis. So the station let me open up a record shop. And I would sell tickets, concert tickets, sell records, but she would run it. And so while I'm on the air around, I'm on the air doing a 5-hour shift and a 4-hour shift, I would call up and says, what kind of day did we have? And then she would says, why you ask me these questions all the time? And I was buying savings bonds and putting her name on the savings bonds and my name on the savings bonds. And so one day I said, let me check my savings bonds. And let me check the money. And so I started calling, and she says, why do you have to call me every time you're on the air to ask me what kind of day it's going on? I said, well, how much money did we make? And we were making money, and she was spending money, and she was going shopping. And one day I went to the bank, and with some savings bonds, I had a stack of them, and then the stack was this. And the manager at the bank said to me, it was Bank of Indiana. She says, well, her name was on them also. So she cashed them. And I couldn't believe it, because I was a guy that was going out doing hustles and, doing concerts and everything. And so I saw her changing. She was getting older, and I was getting older. And by the time I was 28 years old, the marriage broke up. And I went to New York, and I saw my kids. I couldn't believe it. But I'm glad that they went to grade school in Long Island for a while. Then she got married to an older guy, and he was good. He taught my son to play chess. My son plays chess to this very day. Every single day he plays chess, So she didn't make no mistakes in that area. It's just that we got married so young, but we stayed friends, and I was always there at the graduations, the birthday parties. So I talk to my kids now, they says, it seemed like you were always there.
So the point being that when you wanted to go to Nashville, the marriage split up, and that gave you a good opportunity to go on to this new job in Nashville.
Right, and it also did a lot for my career.
1974, more
73.
73, okay.
And she said, I can't go on any longer, because she saw the personality coming out of me. So she says, because I gave her all the responsibility of taking care of the bills. I said, you take care, I'll make the money, you take care of this. So she felt that she was raising me, taking care of me. And then I had 3 cars. I took the car away from her. I shouldn't have done it, but I did. And then she had to go to work. And that's when she realized, how am I going to get money from this guy? But the kids were in New York, so I was sending the money to, my parents and my mother and her mother in New York, it's one of those domestic things that a lot of guys go through, you know.
Sure.
So the divorce was final, and I went back to Indianapolis, and the divorce was final. And I paid some back money because I'm used to giving her all the money. So in fact, they called me in the station one time. They says, you know, your ex-wife called the radio station and says that you owe money. And I couldn't believe that because I had never been in that position before. And then the state had to pay them money, and then they would send money to her. And I said, after a while, about some months later, maybe a year later, I said, why don't I just pay you the money, and we don't have to go through the state? And it never changed. I was able, you know, I just send money.
So, 1973, WLAC Nashville, big market for you, a step up in a big station. What is it like to go to live in Nashville in 1973? What was that experience like for you, being from New York originally?
Oh, yeah, I
What's,
knew that.
What's Nashville like?
A lot of the guys who knew me said that I couldn't handle it, but they didn't really know me. They didn't know that I had that burning desire to do it. And I still had that pain in my chest because I was so in love with my first wife, and I believed in keeping the family together. I mean, she became a Catholic to marry me. I was really serious about that, you know. But a lot of people saw her, and they said they didn't see anything about it. They said, what's so pretty about her? Well, what about this, you know? Because I remember when I first met Oprah, you know, I knew there was something up there, you know. So I knew that my career was going to boom. And the only time, and I was spending time at the station because the equipment was different. It wasn't records. Everything was on carts. And then a half an hour show would come on, and I would, you know, get used to the music and practice and practice and practice. And then officially they says, okay, you're hired, and you're going on starting at 8 o'clock at night, you know. And I was playing top 40 and R&B.
In the same format,
Right.
same show.
And when I grabbed that mic, and when I went at the radio station, I was home. I was like in heaven. But when I was off, I was. It took me a year to get over the pain. You know, somebody taking your money, and somebody who, you know, like guys were showing me pictures of her, and I had brought a brand new car, and I said, hey, take the car and go to Atlanta. And somebody would come back with pictures of her, and you know, I never said this on camera to nobody before. But anyway, I saw that. I had to go through that, you know. But I would say Catholicism, you know, because I was raised that way. You know, I go to church, and then, you know, I had a lot of influences, Irish, Jewish. Jewish guys told me a lot of things, working in the Jewish bakery, you know, kosher bakery through high school. But the Catholicism, I think, really molded me to have a conscience, you know, and I got through it. Man, the rosary, I was going to mass on Sunday, and guys in Nashville says, man, you know, how are you going to meet somebody? How are you going to meet somebody? You're going to the wrong church, because I didn't go to the black church. I went to Catholic church. St. Mary's right downtown Nashville. I say that's where I was raised that way. That's how it was, you know.
But was there culture shock living in Nashville from having been from New York and things like that?
No, I went to any restaurant I wanted because I thought it was okay. And then I had position, because I remember doing some older women said something to me. They says, well, you don't feel any segregation because you have a position. You at WLAC, WLA Life and Casualty Insurance Company. That's a big radio station. So, and then at that same year, I believe Oprah Winfrey was hired at WLAC TV, but in a different side of town. So I never really got to, I know her, I met her, but it was affirmative action that got us both there. I think it was affirmative action because Life and Casualty Insurance Company wanted an African-American to take Jarnon's place. And I know Chris, I can't think of his name, was the news director of WLAC TV, was really after Oprah. I never had a conversation with her, but I heard her talk about it on TV. But I did know her theater coach in college, and he approached me and he says, Spider, you're on the radio. He said, why don't you take some classes, theater classes, during the daytime over here with me? And at that time, they had just started a communication department at Tennessee State University. And I took a lot of communication classes, and I never took any theater classes because I thought I could be a natural actor. I just think I can act, you know. So I never took those classes, but I regret because Dr. Cox taught her something. You know, I mean, she did it on her own because, you know, her grandmother said she used to read and talk to the animals when she was a kid, you know, and she knew the Bible. This I'm talking about Oprah now, and the kids at school used to mess with her, and she would recite the Bible to them, and they were scared of her. because she knew the Bible, you know. But we never had this kind of, I never had that kind of conversation with her, other than the fact one time I says, let's go to lunch one day, and she said, okay. And I did a show with Wolfman Jack, and she came over to really support me. And I looked at her and I says, like, hey, this is my territory. What are you doing over here? You know, she looked at me, she said, oh my gosh. And she was young, you know. And then I calmed down and I told Wolfman Jack, I said, that girl right there is going to be huge. And I saw this big smile on her face. You know, she would never admit to this probably, you know. And she saw this big smile on her face. And I said, he said, Wolfman Jack said, what's her name? I said, her name is Oprah Winfrey. And he lived long enough to see her do her show. I think she had went to Chicago. And I think just when she went into syndication or did that movie with Steven Spielberg, I think right after that, that's when Wolfman died. But I think he lived to see Oprah Winfrey become that superstar.
Also went to Baltimore at one point,
Yeah,
too.
from Baltimore, yeah.
Anything on WLAC, famous station? Nothing there? So what was your evolution at WLAC? I mean, how many years were you there? And
It was fantastic. I remember the program director, his name was Dick Kent, just like Dick Kent. He says, if you, and also there was a consultant by the name Kent Burkhardt. He was consulted 1,000 radio stations in America. He became the consultant to help change the format from the old R&B at nights. And I remember him telling me, he says, you do what I tell you to do. He says, Elvis Presley will call you up. And Elvis died the night I was on the air. I never will forget that. And he was in Atlanta, and he could hear me clear as a bell. And the format had changed. The intro records were like 15 seconds, 10 seconds. And he said, where did you get your training? I said, CW Post College and Jerry Bowling, some names I threw out there. He said, you can say so much in 15 seconds, and 10 seconds, and 12 seconds. It could have been about a zip code or a rip or a little rhyme or something. But he says, and I have that in writing right now from him, that I was able to do that over an intro of a record and keep the format going, you know. And I would write my show out, you know. I would write what I'm going to say, and, you know, whether it was Paul McCartney and Wings or Helen Reddy or whatever, you know.
well, that sort of pithy, quick into the intros and in and out is more like that boss radio thing of the
Right,
quick patter
yeah.
and the less is more. I didn't ask you this, and I should have because you were on the East Coast, but that boss radio thing, which started out here, really swept the nation.
Yeah.
And had such an impact on every place. How much awareness did you have of that style, and was that affecting the work you were doing at all in the late 60s when it swept back east?
No, CKLW had an influence on a lot of guys who came. CKLW was like out of Canada. That could be heard in Boston, the Buffalo area. And there was a kid by the name of Gary Bird, had that top 40 style. And then when the jingles came in, seemed like, I thought it all started in New York, really, on WWRL when the jingles came in. And then I just do a personality to say anything crazy or to grab people's attention over the intro of a record. Even talk about the lyrics of a record before the song comes on during the intro. So to me, it all started in New York. I didn't know anything about boss radio.
It's a good question. Where do the Pam's jingles and all that? Pam's of Dallas.
Pam's was done in Dallas because it was a right-to-work station.
And also there's
But the Drake format used Johnny Mansingers
Johnny Man-
in L.A.
Yeah.
And the Drake format started in Fresno, swept into KHJ, and then Bill Drake and Gene Chenault, his partners,
Right.
spread across the country.
Drake and all, yeah. And then Kent Burkhardt came in.
Burkhardt and Lee Abrams.
Yeah, and Lee, right.
The consultants of the 80s.
Right.
So are we saying that the jingles have been around forever, but this sense of jingle does start with the Drake thing, or
The Drake jingle was unique in that it was all a cappella and it was fast. Those logos were 2 seconds.
Yeah.
KHJ, 93, KH, it was so quick. And that is where the jingle industry changed as a result, because before that you had these long songs.
30 seconds or even more
right, and all
sometimes?
this, all that musical. This was just a cappella, bright, fast, quick, and man, it was so tight.
Yeah.
But Pam's had pithy stuff too. So does the pithy
That followed.
follows Drake, follows the Johnny Man?
Drake was the innovator in all of that.
Okay. So we're in Nashville, WLAC, and it was owned when you went there by the life insurance company.
Right.
The station is sold at some point.
Right, it was. It's a life and casualty insurance company. What Jim Ward told me, he says, well, John R. was retiring. He had emphysema. You know, he was going to retire anyway because he had been there for 32 years. And they said that, well, the mail orders, mail orders, even Russ Limbaugh bought records from Randy's record market. He'll tell you that, because you can hear the station all over. And he said that that demographic had grown older, from the 50s, 60s, and then, the music was changing. But Life and Casualty still owned the station.
Pardon me, I'm not really following. If Life and Casualty owns the station, is Randy's Record Mart just brokering time?
Right.
Okay, they don't really own the station.
No.
They're just a major funder of the station,
Right,
basically.
and advertise at nights, right. And they would
Okay.
buy 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and they sold like over $1 million and 1 million copies of 1 million Bibles.
And during the 15 minutes, you play only their records that they want played or something? or-
Right. When I first went, I did Ernie's Record Mart, and then Randy's was still there. So I did 45 minutes of Ernie's, and I would pick up what Ernie wanted me to play. And one of those songs was Disco Duck. It was in the package, believe it or not. And Rick Dees could hear me in Memphis because he couldn't play the song in Memphis. So I showed you my platinum record. I got Disco Duck, Spider-Man Harrison. Spider-Man was a nickname of Spider Harrison. But the jingles, the people in Nashville today have copies of the jingles. They went to Pam and they found the jingles where they're saying Spider-Man Harrison and Spider Harrison. And they were shotgun jingles real fast. Music City, USA, 15 LAC, because Burke, they cut the W off. Everything was LAC. 15 LAC, everything became shorter. Mm-hmm. So it was, it worked. And the ratings kept coming out, and I was pulling the kids, and the kids were, I would go out to the high schools, and the kids were, it was unbelievable.
We were saying about the evolution of the station being sold and those things.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that all evolved.
Well,
You
really
said
what
the
happened-
demographic was changing, and
Yeah, that, and then it was a business decision. Just like I get a little check now from AGI because Life and Casualty Insurance Company was bought by American Insurance, and AGI bought them all, and they found me through my Social Security. So when I turned a certain age,
unstated for the cabinet, yes.
I get a little check every month, and
Yes.
it's nice, You go to the 99-cent store and buy me some goodies. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so
Is this part of a pension, you're saying?
yeah, it was,
Okay.
yeah, and they found me through my Social Security. But anyway, it was, if I had to listen to Hoss Allen, I could have made some very wise decisions working for a major company at that time because it was owned by an insurance company. I could have put away a lot of money and probably been, could have did real well. But what happened was the FCC was real strict at that time. And we were running promos, and you had to log the promos. If you we would do a concert, and then you would had to log the whole length of the record. And at that time, the station was fined, and Life and Casualty Insurance Company didn't like that. And they got a $10,000 fine. I still have that article. And so Life and Casualty said, well, we're going to pay the fine. And that's when Life and Casualty Insurance Company decided that they didn't want that image. They were fined by the FCC for the first time after all those years of playing R&B records. They never had a problem until they went top 40 with Dick Kent, and they brought in Kent Burkhardt. And then they let a lot of guys go. Kent Burkhardt came in and started throwing carts all over the place. And he approached me, and he says, where'd you get your training? And I told him where I was from. And I was the only guy that survived. And it wasn't because I was African-American. It was because of my talent, I think. Because they brought in another African-American guy who was real good. And one day he came to work, and he says, me and my family are leaving because they got who they want. I says, it's a competitive market. Everything is competing. I wanted to be better than anybody on the radio station. And I worked at it. I didn't just go to work. I would go home and write liners out and practice. And, I practiced hard. And it worked. And the ratings came out, and it showed up.
So when does Billboard come into all of this?
Billboard magazine, when Life and Casualty decided to sell, a gentleman by the name of Mort Nassiter, who was the president of MGM Records here in California. And Mort became the president, and he went to England with MGM, and him and his wife moved to Nashville. And he heard about the sale of WLAC, and he knew the image of that radio station. He knew the power of it. And he convinced Mr. Littlefoot, who owned Billboard, his family started Billboard magazine like in the late 1800s, to buy WLAC for like $7 million to AM and the FM. And that's when they sold it. And then Kent left right after that, after Billboard bought it. And that's when, that's when I did the Billboard Soul Countdown, because Casey was doing the top 40 countdown. And then Billboard magazine, they're the ones who got the fine. That's what it was. They were fined. Wait, I'm trying to get the years together here. Billboard magazine Billboard magazine felt it was a conflict because they were so strong in the industry. They're a publication, but they felt that they had influence on getting records played and made and break and whatnot. That's how strong they were. And they decided that it's a conflict. And so that's when Bill Littlefoot said, we're going to sell the station. I think they kept it exactly 3.5, 4 years. And they sold it. Morton Astor was trying to say, Bill, I heard him on the phone, don't do it. It's going to be worth a lot of money one day. And he was right. And of course, Clear Channel wound up buying it. And,
So you're saying that after Billboard owned the station for a period of time, they were forced to sell by the FCC?
Well, yeah, they didn't have to. They could have held on, but they got an offer from Woody Sudbrink, because by that time, AM radio was going news talk.
We're in the 80s now.
Yeah,
right?
information.
Okay.
They started going
Yeah.
information, but it was still big. AM radio was still big in a lot of markets. Even on ABC was still doing well in New York and a lot of stations out in California. But a lot of markets was FM radio was coming on and cutting to the AM signals. So everybody saw that change, and then music radio stations had to pay a lot of money to BMI and ASCAP. Part of this sales was going to ASCAP and BMI. And I used to always hear the sales managers complaining, how much money we got to give BMI this month, this quarter, Well, it was using the music to attract an audience to sell advertising. And so with information radio, they didn't have to pay, anybody. And then information radio became conservative news talk radio, and it took off.
So let's don't skip Billboard in the sense that you mentioned the Billboard Soul Countdown, and you mentioned that Casey was doing his countdown at that time. How does this start? How did you become the host of it? Was it something that you proposed, or did they come to you and tell you they wanted to start this thing?
Well, we were running, Casey was all over. Everybody was picking up his show. And I went to Morton Astor, and I went in the production room and put together a demo, because I was pretty good at production, analog, and it blew him away. I had Joe Tex and some other people on it, and he said, oh, this is great. And then they had a thing called The Sound of Music, and they started doing syndicated shows. I can't think of some of the other ones.
So Billboard was already syndicating some shows, and you have an idea that you might
Right.
have a syndicated show with
Right,
Billboard.
and I says, how about a Soul Countdown? And they got the budget for it. And I started doing Soul Countdown out of Nashville, and they would send demos across the country and buy big ads, gave me big ads in the Billboard magazine. So it really promoted my career.
What year, more or less, does that begin?
It's 1977 to the latter part of 78, 79.
Okay. Was it, in those days, a lot of the music shows would be distributed on LPs?
Right.
Okay,
right.
so is that how it was done?
Right. It was
Okay.
sent out on reel-to-reel to radio stations.
Okay, so on reel, not on LPs?
Yeah.
Okay,
Wolfman's show, I remember Wolfman Jack's show came on disc.
okay.
But Billboard did duplication because Spotland Productions in Nashville did the production, and they would do the duplication and mail them out to the radio stations. The demo went out to over 700 radio stations, and so
Well-
a lot of radio stations played it, and they stayed with it for a while. And then I did the little disco for a while, and then Billboard says we're going to get out of this business.
So this was your first time in syndication, is that right?
Right, and I was told to do it earlier, but that was the first time that, in '77 was the first time.
Well, again, how did you feel about now you're in a big market, now you're syndicated around the country? How did you feel about
I
that?
feel great.
Yeah.
That's when I started thinking movies and everything. But see, I was always working for somebody, you know. So I see, you know, like I see where Oprah is, you know, how she's, you know, how she really survived, and so many other talk show hosts didn't. You know, how she did her thing. You know, I mean, she worked for a TV station, you know, and like you said, Baltimore. And then she went to Chicago, #2 market in the country, and became real famous. And then she didn't even know what syndication was when she was in Chicago. You know, she never thought money.
Well, let's stay on Spider
Yeah,
instead for
I'm
a
trying
moment.
to.
But
Yeah.
so 1977, you're going to do this syndicated Billboard program. Can you talk? Because this is again, it's a syndicated, pre-recorded show. It has to be sent around the country by mail. Can you talk to us about how you produced it? How long it took to produce a weekly show? How far ahead of air did you produce? Couldn't be too far ahead because it's got to be with the countdown.
Right.
How was all that done?
Okay, I had a staff. So we got the budget for a writer, Lee Stevens. I remember him. Still see him when I go back to Nashville. He was a good writer. So we had a writer, had somebody to do research, had 2 writers, and I had someone who would coordinate everything. She also worked for the radio station. So these people also worked for WLAC, and so did I. And Billboard owned the station. So I had a staff of 3 people, and then we would go to Spotland Production in the afternoons, because I worked at nights, so we would do the show in that afternoon. And Lee Stevens, the writer, would meet me, give me the script, and I would go over and just do my voice. And then Spotland Productions would put the music together, and the charts would come over. They would fax them over from New York. And we had a girl named Jean Williams. She also worked for Billboard in L.A. So she would do some spots too. I inspired. I'm in L.A. and this is what's happening in the disco. You know, she was a reporter.
Oh, she was like an insert into the show.
Right.
Okay.
And Ratcliffe Lee, I think he was in New York, but he never really got it. He started writing his own books, and he never did do anything, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we just did the Billboard countdown as it came out every week, you know, and I would just do my voice, track my voice.
You just went in one day and did your tracks, and
Right.
that was it. Okay.
And then somebody would put the music and everything together.
Okay. So you weren't actually involved in the production after just laying down your
No,
voice.
it takes, to have a syndicated show, you got to have 3 or 4 people
Yeah.
if it's going to sound like anything. Well, some guys do it okay, but eventually you got to have somebody out there doing the interviews. Who's going to send you the interviews are coming from L.A., you know, or they come from New York, and you have somebody have to do it all and send it all into Nashville.
So in those days, I don't know if it's true now. At one time, in the beginning days of easy listening, what they would do is they would take out all the music that didn't sound like MOR easy listening, and they would take what was left and push it all together, and that was the easy listening chart.
Right.
So how was the soul chart made? Were there specific soul charting stations, or was it made by taking the top 40 chart and removing anything that wasn't soul?
Oh no, every station would report.
So there were actual soul stations that reported to a soul
Right.
chart.
Oh
Okay.
yeah. And
Okay.
there was somebody in New York that would, you know, talk to the distributors or the one stops, and the radio stations would report it, and somebody in New York would put it all together, just like they do now, and it worked. And it's sort of computerized now.
But WLAC at the time you were doing this, would that be called a soul station, or would it still be called the top 40 station?
At nights, it was rock and soul.
Rock and
I
soul.
created something called rock and soul because I was able to play R&B songs with rock songs, just like I'm doing now. And then I would play a Barry White and come back with something from Andy Kim, Rock Me Gently, and then a Barry White, and it worked. You know, sometimes the tempos were the same, and I would say my little bits in between, and it worked.
Were you programming your own music at that time?
At one time I was, until Kent Burkhardt came, and he says, you know, he followed the chart, and I was happy with that. They were all hits.
Yeah.
And I was happy to know about Paul McCartney and Wings, you know, and Elton John and the Bee Gees. They were all, you know, it was all new material. And it broadened my career. And then the Saturday Night Live came, you know, that era. And the disco era was happening at the same time. And disco didn't sound that good on the radio. That's why that format. But Kent Burkhardt thought that disco was going to replace R&B. Of course, it didn't.
So you mentioned that the disco began. You did it the Billboard Soul Countdown became a disco countdown at one point, or
Well,
disco got involved in it, or what are you saying there?
yeah, a lot of the early disco music was like Chic, La Freak. So one week I would do maybe the top 10 disco songs of the week into the Soul Countdown. And then we were going to do a whole disco thing because the disco took off, you know. And by that time, Billboard wanted to get out of the business. I think I got
So,
that right.
anything on countdowns or syndication, anything like that? Okay. So, you mentioned the early '80s, they want to get out of the business more or less, and you mentioned they sold the station completely.
Right.
What at some point, I guess your next stop is Los Angeles after that, isn't it?
Right. Well, I created a concept. I says, what can I do on my own that could never go away? And it was called Whatever Happened to the old artists, the older artists. And I created that through BRE, Sidney Miller. And he wanted to know if I could do it every week. And I had a lot of interviews myself with Betty Wright and, you know, Clean Up Woman and a lot of people, a lot of folks I had.
Stuff that you had more or less in the morgue.
Right.
Because you had taped them at some point in the past.
Right. So when I came to LA, I really came out here with Sugar Hill Records.
Well, maybe stop and say, why did this job end in Nashville? Why did you leave Nashville?
Well, what happened is I stayed in Nashville, and they says, why don't you do a talk show? So I was still Spider Harrison's talk show.
On radio.
On radio. Oh, yeah.
Okay,
on,
the
on
beginning of...
WLAC, but Woody Sudbrink bought the station from Billboard.
And took it talk?
He took the AM talk, and he had classical rock on the FM.
Okay.
Okay, so the sales manager, the one who changed the logo on NBC, Dick Casper was his name. You know, the logo was
The 13 or something feathers to the few
Right.
feathers?
yeah.
Okay.
The guy who changed that logo, his name was Dick Casper, and him and his wife worked at NBC in New York, and it became a computer. It's still there, but it's a computer. Dick Casper became the sales manager with Woody Sudbrink and came to Nashville. And he pulled me to the side and says, well, he says, you know, the world is not looking for 40-year-old disc jockeys because I was getting older. You know, I was in my 30s. So he said, I didn't buy that. So he says, why don't you stay in Nashville and learn sales and do a talk show? And he cleared it with Woody. And so I was bringing people on, artists, recording artists, songwriters. Buddy Killen, the phone was ringing off the hook, John R., you know, and talking about the music industry. And it was real popular, you know.
Was this a daily talk show?
It
or
was a weekend.
weekend show?
Yeah, because I went into sales because I wanted to know. I did sales with Remington, so I says if you know sales, then you really know radio. And there's a lot of program directors today are not in radio because they never went into sales. Because now you have one marketing director who may program 10 radio stations in a market. So there's no such thing as a program director anymore. They're marketing directors, you know. So I said, I want to learn sales, you know, more to be able to sell radio. And I was in a position to buy stations. I didn't have the money, and I missed out on a lot of opportunities. You know, I can tell you some stories that you won't believe, you know. So, but I've said the most important thing, let me just stay healthy. Let me take care of my health. And so I would lay in the bed sometimes. I'm not going out Saturday, and I'm just going to sleep and rest. You know, so, I mean, even at this age, I can still run. I can think I can outrun a lot of kids in high school, at least for 10 yards.
So, a 10-yard dash. So here's the thing, though. You mentioned beginning in the talk radio.
Yeah.
This is still the Fairness Doctrine era, and this is before talk radio became so overtly political as it did become, and as it still is, really. So, what was the format? What was the talk format like at this station?
Well, it was like it is now. They would bring on controversial people. And, they would bring in guys out of Miami. They would knock the Ku Klux Klan, and you know, I mean, Ku Klux Klan came to the.
But did they have to give equal time then?
No, they didn't. They had to sometime.
So this is after the Fairness Doctrine thing ends. Okay.
Well, yeah, the Ku Klux Klan came to the radio station when I was a disc jockey, and they just looked at me, and I looked at them because I said, you know, I'm from Long Island. It didn't. It wasn't about being scared. It just, you know, I didn't know who they were. You know, it was no big deal. But I remember they wanted to buy time, and the sales manager wouldn't sell them any time. They said that was the KKK. I said, we put the KKK on the radio in Indianapolis, and the ratings went off the roof. You know, I never will forget that. It was, you know, they were and they were political. There was politics. They weren't violent. You know, they just had their views, and we would put them on. When I was program director at WTLC,
Interesting. Yeah.
you know, and we did it for ratings because everybody would. You don't do it anymore. You know, I mean, you know, things have changed, but it was done at that time.
Well, there was a lot of Klan activity in places like Ohio and Indiana and
Yeah,
things like that at one
especially
time.
Indiana. Cheney was
Yeah.
the Grand Dragon. I never will forget it. He came down to the station one night, and he had about 4 guys with him, and came in there with my New York cap on, set them up with the microphones, and everything was cool, you know.
So, anyway, we're talking about the format of the
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
talk radio format in Nashville.
Yeah, but that was so. Anyway, I got used to talk shows. That was a public affairs show that we did the Ku Klux Klan in Indianapolis on a music radio station. To help on the weekends, we had Stephen Fletcher on too. I never will forget that interview about how the black actors used to be back in the day. I never will forget that as long as I live. He was very defensive because I was asking him some questions, but somebody else was on the show also. You know, I was trying to do it all, even the high school football. But I never will forget that interview with Stephen Fletcher. Never will forget that. Yeah. And somebody brought him in. A nightclub had brought him in, and he just says that's what it was back in those days. He said that's what it was. I never will forget that. And I didn't tape it. And I wish I had taped it, man. And I don't have any pictures, anything of it, you know. But anyway, moving on to WLAC, I was kind of used to news talk radio. I knew it was coming in, and I would pick my guests, and it would be in the Newsday and the newspaper, the Tennessean. Spider Harrison show, going to have Buddy Killam on or whoever, you know. Then I started bringing in bankers, and I started getting into subjects that I didn't know. And I said, well, J.B. Stone was program director of 2 stations out here, at KGFJ and another station. And he had called me up and he says, why don't you come on out to California? And I says, okay. And I called Sugar Hill Records, Joe Robinson. So he said, okay, why don't you go on out there and go by the distributor, pick up some money. And I gave all my furniture to my ex, you know, because she was going through some problems with her second child. And it just so happened my daughter called me. I think she was in high school. So I said, good, I don't have to put this stuff in storage. Come take everything. And I went and got some money I wasn't playing records, so it wasn't payola money. But Sugar Hill liked me because I was from Long Island and I knew Joe Robinson. I'd seen Sylvia with Mickey and Sylvia at the Apollo Theater when I was a kid. And he says, go over to the distributor, get you some money. And I had a little Honda. And I jumped in my Honda with a lot of money in my pocket. And I came to California, got me a nice apartment in Silver Lake area. And so I was set up. And I knew everybody out here. I knew Don Cornelius. I had met him. So I didn't have any problems like a lot of people come out and trying to get started. And J.B. Stone says, wait a minute, because I'm going to give you a position. And he went to KJLA station, and by that time, I had created a show called Whatever Happened To, because I knew I had control of it. And Sidney Miller says, can you print it every week in the magazine? I said, yes. So that was still something that I learned, narrative profile at Tennessee State, writing articles. And I turned it into an audio show, and I sent it out to radio stations. It was a vignette at first, Whatever Happened To. And I was in Cincinnati, Atlanta, Jackson, Mississippi.
It began as a feature, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a 5-minute show. And then stations started dictating they wanted a half-hour show. And some wanted a 5-minute show. Then they wanted something every week, And then what happened, Kevin Fleming hired me on KGFJ. So I did part-times on KGFJ.
Well, let's clarify. Did you come out here, when you first came out, did you have the Sugar Hill gig or the KGFJ gig?
I had
both?
I had the Sugar Hill gig first.
Okay.
But Sugar Hill told me, they says, some of those guys out there ain't going to like you because you're from WLAC and you were big, and you're going to have a hard time with some of the black programmers out there. And J.B. Stone eventually left KJLA, Stevie Wonder station, and I had a hard time, keeping the show on KJLH. I never went to Stevie Wonder directly. I probably could have, but I didn't. And then I went into the cable industry, and I did Whatever Happened To with Comcast Cable.
On television?
Oh, yeah, out here.
Yeah. Well, let's don't get
I know I'm running on
too far afield of Sugar
know.
Hill. Can you describe what your role was with Sugar Hill when you first came here?
Well, okay. I was doing promotion. And I didn't really like the title of being a promoter, but Grandmaster Flash was on the label at the time. And I never will forget it. We took the record over to K-Rock, and I heard that, I was at LAX, and I heard it on K-Rock. And Grandmaster Flash was, I mean, they started it all. They were the first rap group to make the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And Joe Robinson convinced me. And he bought the Chess record catalog. And he said, Spider, he said, this is the biggest independent black record label in America, Sugar Hill Records. You know, Rapper's Delight was unbelievable. It started the 12-inch chart in Billboard. You know, it was so big, you know. They couldn't get Curtis Blow, but they was trying to get him. And then Grandmaster for the Sugar Hill Gang and Grandmaster Flash. So I was making a lot of money. And then we got a distribution deal with MCA, and I started thinking movies. And then the people at MCA says, Joe, if you deliver, you can do movies and everything. And they did. You know, they did some soundtracks and whatnot. You know, I got a little piece of it. I felt a check for $300,000 one time, but I had to send it to New York. You know, so I said, this is going to be nice. MCA, you know, and then it became, you know, organized crime was into the music industry at that time, and I got caught up in it somewhat. But because I had a radio background, I still had my Whatever Happened To show going, and I got married and moved out here. And then met Art Astor, and Art, you know, says come to work for me. And I was still doing I ran the show on cable, the Whatever Happened To, because I had to keep Spider Harrison going, Spider Harrison Productions going. You know, I had to show a track record that I still had. I got a trademark on it. But I wanted to stay Spider Harrison. But I only did radio on KGFJ, and Whatever Happened To show ran on KJLH. And I called Johnny, what's his name? Johnny K.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I said, Johnny, I know I met his sister and his brother-in-law since I've been in PBB. I said, I know more about you now than when you were in radio. But, you know, he had a different, you know, I was more personality, and the people, I guess a lot of people would have liked it. I think I could have been a star if I had got on and do what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. If I had stayed on KGFJ, I would have been.
Phil, pardon me. Where does Johnny K come in? What was he doing
I was
at that
calling
time?
him also.
But what station was he at that time?
He had gone. He was at all of them, but K-Earth.
He was at K-Earth at that time.
Right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And you wanted a gig at K-Earth, you're saying?
Yeah, and I had called him also about the Motown 50th anniversary, because I had a show, and Motown wouldn't. You know, Barry Gordy wanted to do his thing. He didn't want to do it at all. And then, of course, Motown, Universal had bought the Motown label. So Mary Wilson hosted it, you know, and it got on K-Earth, but they had to go over Johnny to get it on. That's something we don't have to talk about, but, you know, I thought I would share that.
Well, let's don't throw away a very brief comment that you made,
Yeah.
rather cryptic, that is, a mention of organized crime, and I got involved in that a little bit. Now, since you tossed it out there,
Yeah.
do you want to explain in any bit what you mean by that, what happened?
Well, Sugar Hill saw vinyl going out, and CDs were coming in. And Joe Robinson wanted he was able to get the Chess record catalog from Marshall Chess's family, you know. So he was able to get that catalog, and that was strong. You know, Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley, all the blues and everything, it's still strong. And he had his label and all his hits on all platinum with the Moments and, you know, and all that. So he had a strong catalog, and he had the rap, Grandmaster Flash and everything. So he couldn't get a deal with Capitol Records because they says, well, we can't control Joe Robinson because he's got the pressing plants across the country. He's going to press records behind your back, and he won't, you know, he'll do all this distribution, you know. And I was right there, right in the middle of it. And I'm sitting up there at Capitol Records in the lobby with Joe Robinson, and I think it was Joe Smith or somebody wouldn't come out to meet him. And I was there, and, you know, and then we left. And then Joe went through somebody, and he went and found a guy by the name of Sal Pasillo. And Joe called me up one Sunday, and he said, Spider, he says, I got a call. It was interesting being with Sugar Hill and just getting to know the music industry and being at WLAC because a lot of things came to me, a lot of independent labels. Mary Tyler Moore had a label that started in Nashville, and I met Tommy West, who did all the Jim Croce stuff. So a lot of things happened with the Sugar Hill. So I saw myself making money and being popular and still being out there. I said, hey, I'm doing everything now. And I had wrote a song in 1971, but I didn't understand the publishing back then. I was kidding around with a song called Beautiful Day. I'll tell you about that later. It got on Entourage in 2007. I made $10,000. you know, and and if I hadn't gone with Sugar Hill, I never would have met Stevie Wonder's cousin, who helped me with my publishing. I got to know publishing, and I should have gotten to know publishing when I was in Nashville, but I didn't because I was so into radio then. So Joe Robinson gave me a call because he wanted a major distribution deal, and he says, you can do your syndicated show, radio show, and you can do the records too. You can do everything. But if I hadn't went to work for Universal, I would have to give up everything because they make you sign something that you can't do anything. So I didn't want to go to MCA to be a promotion guy because you can't do nothing but MCA promote their records. You have to sign that kind of clause with them. And Joe Robinson got the distribution deal, but he got it through a guy named Sal Pasillo. And Sal Pasillo, it was a gangster from New York. When he came out to California, I think in the 60s, it was an LA Times, New York mobster comes to California to organize. And I met him. And I met him when I met him at the Beverly Hills Hotel on a Sunday. I went in and I was so frightened of this man. He was big, and he was Sal Pasillo with his glasses on. I turned around and jumped in my car and went home. I had a condo in North Hollywood at the time, and I said, "What am I getting myself into?" Because I saw the killer instinct in that guy. He was a real mobster. Had a scar on his face, you know. And the next morning, I came over. Joe flew in. I picked him up at the airport. We went over to the Beverly Hills Hotel. I met Sal Pasillo, and he looked at me, started smiling because he knew he had saw me, and he had a young girl with him, and we sat and talked. And Sal told me, you know, what he does, and he said, "We're going to get a deal. We're going to get the deal at Universal." And he muscled his way in. Man, the United States Marshal Service came to my house. This is before I met Bernadette, though, you know. And I remember the marshals, you know, there was a federal prosecutor was trying to get Sal Pasillo, and they was trying to figure out how did Sugar Hill Records get into Universal. How did that deal happen? And I was at that meeting. That meeting was in studio at Universal at the Sheraton. And there was a guy named Milton Malden. He was from Yugoslavia, taught me how to say Yakshimas, how are you in Yugoslav. But he was introduced to Joe Robinson by Morris Levy. And here I'm sitting there with these guys, Sal Pasillo and Joe Robinson. And the first thing I says, how come, and Sidney Lauper's lawyer, Joe Zenzak, was at the meeting. And I said, how come Sylvia's not here? Because it was her label. You know, she was a creative person, you know, writing all the songs and whatnot, you know. But Joe was running all the business. And the lawyer says, power of attorney. That's the first thing they all said to me. So they talked to me. They said, power of attorney. And but Universal had heard about Spider Harrison. This Spider Harrison, he can get records played. You know, the disc jockeys respect him, and I can go anywhere and get a record played. I go to Detroit and get in the car on the way to the airport. I hear the record being played. So, but a lot of guys like me, you know, and I had resources to help that happen. But I never will forget the feds were trying to get Sal Pasillo, and I got to know him. I had lunch with him at Marabella's on Sunset a couple of times. And the feds would always come and start watching him. Went to a couple other restaurants. I got to know him real good, you know. And he kept telling me what kind of woman did he want. That he wanted a black chick. That he liked black pussy. And he says, don't give me no. He said, bring me some black pussy. That's what he said to me, you know. So I said, okay. And then what's the name of the restaurant down on, I can't think of that restaurant. The Palm. That's where everybody used to hang out. And one time at the table, we met at the Palm, and he tried to talk down to me, and he says, Spider, go get me a pack of cigarettes. And I looked at him. That's when I said, hey, you got to show him that I'm a man. And I called the waiter, and I said, hey, this gentleman wants some cigarettes. And Joe Robinson had a big smile on his face because he saw me stand up to him. And Joe was, Joe would use the N-word in front of these guys a lot to try to make himself look good. He did it in New York. He just did it a lot. That was the thing. I'll just sit there and listen. Because I knew I had radio behind me, and I knew I had built a name, Spider Harrison. I knew I had built a name, so I knew I had that going for me. But it was, it's something that was established. So I always felt kind of secure, and I knew that I could have went back down south, like Tom Jordan. I could have went down south and called somebody in Florida, somebody, hey, give me a job, And I was offered positions in South Carolina, but I didn't want to live in the South. I wanted New York, LA, and I still do. I still think that way. But I'm comfortable in Nashville. You know, I'm very comfortable there. I go there and everybody treats me right, you know, and, you know, they still kid me sometimes about the way I talk and the things that I say, you know, because the guy who lets me, he grew up, the reason why I'm in Nashville now is because some younger guys were listening to me in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who got in radio 40 years ago and became very wealthy and found me 7 years ago on the internet. They said, we see you doing a show called Rock and Soul America. I said, yeah, because I always kept doing things. And that's when they says, you want to do some voice tracks for us? I said, yeah. And people think I'm there. I do tracks every day. They think I'm in Nashville right now.
Well,
And then I was inducted to the Tennessee Radio Hall of Fame in 2015.
Before we wrap up with the Nashville part, during the years that you're doing Sugar Hill Records, you're doing some features like the Whatever Happened To.
Yeah.
Did you have any daily radio gigs during that period, or was it all the promotional work and the features and things?
It was money syndication, but I couldn't. It was hard getting sponsors.
Okay.
So the money was coming from BRE magazine, to write the article, and then I would do the audio. I would take the money and do the audio. I had two partners, but you know, it didn't happen.
So most of your work in that time was syndicating programs,
Yeah,
or
syndication
trying to
program.
pitch shows. Yeah.
Yeah, syndication program on cable and print.
Anything about any of this period that interests you that you have to throw in about, or to add your knowledge to, and the deficit of my knowledge?
When you mentioned Morris Levy,
Yeah.
big tilt came on. Did you know Joe Isgrove?
Joe Isgrove came after. He came around the same time, but just when he came after, that's when the record industry. Joe was big, but then Clear Channel started buying all the stations, and he couldn't manipulate those big corporations like that. So then he got indicted for his muscle, and that's when everybody realized that he had a toupee and false teeth when he went to jail and everything. So to me, he was around. I remember his name. I never met him. But Priscilla went to federal prison for a year.
That was the MCA cutouts.
Right, yeah. Priscilla went to jail for a year. He was a model prisoner. And they really got him because he bought a Cadillac, bought a cash Cadillac, And every time I would get money, Joe said, pick up $4,000, $5,000. I had to give it to Sal. I wanted to put some in my pocket, But I did well. I was going skiing on weekends, going to Hawaii. So I did okay.
And that was from
My associate.
It was from pressing too many copies, selling them out the back door, basically.
Yeah, it was Joe Robinson had control of a pressing plant in New Jersey, one in Nashville, and one in California, and he could press records. He burnt all of them. He would file bankruptcy, I wouldn't pay him or pay him so much, And then he let me start my own independent record label out here,
Were you present when they got MCA in trouble?
Yeah, oh yeah, I was right there, yeah. Zach Horowitz, I saved him because it was he took the fifth in court, and one day I called him up because Joe and Sylvia had split for a minute, and Sylvia started her own record label, and they sent me the label, and so I did a deal. $35,000 I'm behind on my mortgage, but the bankers knew it was the court, and everybody says, I stayed in a condo for a whole year and didn't pay anybody because all this money was coming from the chess deal and everything, and I'm being loyal to them, I was able to eat because I was working, And that's when I went and finished up my associates at Valley College. I got my BA from the University of Laverne. I kept going to school. But anyway.
How did you separate from Sal and all of this that was going on? Because you don't necessarily walk away from some of these guys.
Yeah, they didn't bother me. They didn't. I went to court, and I sat in the back. They had lawyers on Sal's side. All of them went to the same university. These guys went to Harvard or Colgate or Yale. And I was in the court, in the back of the court, just listening to what was going on. And then Sal was sentenced. Zach Horowitz did a deal with Sylvia because Joe Robinson was trying to sue him, And he says, bring me the record. And then Zach Horowitz gave Sylvia and Joey Jr. a deal. So it saved him. And I got away from him, and that's when I met Bernadette, who worked for the U.S. Marshal Service. And I got married, and I kept coming out here and seeing her and whatnot. And I was on KGFJ at the time too. You know? So I'm trying to get, it was all happening at the same time. Because when I met Bernadette, I was on KGFJ, and she worked for the U.S. Marshal Service. And she kept telling me, she says, if the Robinsons threaten you, let me know, and I'll tell Sam. And Sam Cicchino was the U.S. Marshal at the time. He lived out here, and all those Marshal guys live here. Joe Knoll still lives in Ontario, and so nobody never threatened me. Everybody felt that she was protecting me, but I wasn't. I remember picking up the checks. Sal would always have some young guy out there looking at me, but I played football. I wasn't gonna be bullied. I knew that I was doing something that wasn't gonna last. I was worried about where's my money gonna come from, more so than getting beat up. I wasn't worried about that.
So let's, before we wrap this up, let's just clarify. You've mentioned a couple of times being on KGFJ. What were you doing on KGFJ? You did have this is not the syndicated thing. This is something else you're doing, right?
Right. Kevin Fleming hired me because he knew I was a jock, and he was the program director, and they were playing oldies. And Kevin Fleming said, "I'm going to give you a spot on the weekends."
What year, more or less?
This was I married Bernadette in 87, 88, 87, 88, yeah.
Okay.
88, 89, somewhere in that area.
So late 80s oldies format.
Right, and Bill Shear owned the station. He also worked with Art Astor at KHJ. And Bill bought the station from somebody, and that didn't last too long because I had problems with the program director they had. And that's when I kept doing Whatever Happened To, because I had that going in print. And it was in the magazine everywhere. And Billboard, and Sidney Miller's magazine was on the newsstands right next to Billboard. That publication was pretty powerful. So that kept me going in print,
And this is the Black Radio exclusive magazine?
Black Radio exclusive magazine,
Yeah.
right. Sidney Miller and his wife. Then they went to jail for a minute. Everybody was doing it. Everything now is legal. But everybody went to jail for something back then, But I came out clean. I saw Grandmaster Flash on the flight. He said, "Man, you survived all of that." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yeah, I survived it." And then when I came out here, I went to work for Comcast Cable, and somebody walked up to me and says, "This is a Jewish company." And I said, "Is it?" And it was Brian Roberts. Today he owns NBC. He's the chairman. And I called him. I don't know, I can't remember if I talked to him or not, but he talked to the regional manager and says, "Who is this Harrison guy in Ontario?" Because this was Comcast Cable out here. And that's when I did public access, and I did Whatever Happened To public access. So I kept it going on TV. I still got the shows, So I kept my name going, something in television, And that was it. And then I did the Rock and Soul America, and then I noticed that the computers started, everybody's talking about MP3s and no analog, and so I got a copy of Adobe Audition and started doing the vocal. And I had a grandson, well, I still have a grandson, but he was helping me with my shows, but he got out of college. He didn't even come out here anymore because it's too far out, It's my son's son. But he's a good kid. And he was helping, he would come out once a month, and I would pay him, and we would finish 4 shows. I was picking up little stations in Kentucky, and they still want these shows.
Are you hustling these shows yourself, or is there someone working?
Well, at that time I was, and I was making money with PIs. I had a deal with PIs, and they would run the PIs, and I was getting some pretty nice checks. Mm-hmm. I still get some PI checks even now, from some of the, I'm doing some PIs from some stations out in Banning, but I'm not doing my show. But I got some old shows, and stations want to run the old shows, and I run some old PIs.
So how many years were you at KGFJ?
So I'm a hustler, about a year.
Okay.
Yeah, and then Bernadette says, "Well, look, you need to come out here." She said, "Find something out here," and then that's when I did the cable.
So your formal return to daily radio, was that with the job in Nashville, or did you work another radio job during that period?
No, I was doing Rock and Soul America, the syndicated show, and it was running in Kentucky. Just kept the name going, and it was streaming, so you could hear it all over. And then Tony Richards in 2007, no, 7 years ago, sent me an email. It was from Federated Media. And he said, I'm the CCF at Federated Media. I'm buying a radio station in Nashville. Spider Harrison I used to listen to when I was in Fort Wayne. I said, yeah. And then we talked. He says, I just put in a loan for $1 million to buy a station. And he moved the transmitter from Cookville to Bellevue. Smart radio. And his brother's the engineer. And I said, well, you're going to get the money. He said, you think so? I says, you at Federated Media and you the CCF? I said, you're going to get that loan in Nashville? So I said, yeah, I'll be part of it. So he says, okay. He said, you're going to do nights? I says, I'll do nights. He said, you have a place to go? I says, I have Adobe Audition and the computer and the microphone. They gave me something better since, I went to Nashville and picked up some better equipment. And he said, just do the tracks. And I mean, it's like an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I got a 5-hour show.
How did you? Is this the first time you had? Of course, you had done tracks for your syndicated show.
Yeah, I was doing tracks. That went on for 2 years, 2.5 years.
But tracking a show versus being there to kind of bob and weave in and out of the records live, or I'm using the term records in quotes, the music live. Yeah. It's a different thing or a different skill. How do you feel about doing a daily show and where it's just you in a room by yourself and your voice?
I got it down because I was gifted with a sense of rhythm, and you got iTunes, and you can hear every record in the world. You can hear the beat, the tempo, and you can talk, you can slow it down, if it's Buffalo, Springfield, whoever. Hippie radio, 94.5, right into it. If there's no intro, I can just talk right into it. And Tony told the program director in Nashville, he says, can you imagine if he could hear the music every day? But people think I'm there. It's a gift, something that I can do well.
Yeah.
Any song, any format, you'll think I'm right there.
So can you explain to us what the format of hippie radio is?
Well, it's Nashville's greatest hits. It's no more 60s. They leaning more toward the 70s and the early 80s.
Well, that's like a lot of other stations.
But the Beatles, we're doing the Beatles. Same thing K-Earth is doing is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I'm a personality disc jockey. I talk about the headboard at nights, move over. Because I'm saying stuff like that on the radio. And Tony says, do your thing. And they love it, and it's working in that market. But people know me there, Will it work in other markets? Yes. Mm-hmm. Now they're talking about putting me on in South Bend.
The same company?
Yeah, well, yeah, they have a station in South Bend. And I listened to it. And I told them the money that I would want. And I says, but you have to send me the logs, the music log and the lines at least 3 days in advance. So I can work Monday, Tuesday, and finish everything and be done with it. Because even in Nashville, they used to send me the logs a whole week. But now Tony's there, so he's a little late with the liners. But I can do the intros, and I go back and put the liners in 10 seconds. So I talk about 6, 7, 8 breaks an hour, that's all.
So you're just doing a day ahead right now?
Right.
Okay.
Today I'll do tomorrow's show.
Okay, yeah.
And look like I can do that for life.
So it must have been a neat thing. That's a Pollyanna-ish way to put it, but it must have been a neat thing after kind of being out of daily radio to have one of your fans ring up and say, "Hey, I liked you as a kid. I listened as a kid, and I want to sort of bring you back into that world of a market that you were known and legendary." What are your feelings about all that?
It's not a day go by. In fact, when I come on, they forward the phones to me. Now, I can answer if I want to.
You can take calls from your market there.
Yeah. Now, at the beginning, I was on from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., and I did that for 3 years. And Tony says, he said, all right, we're going to put you on at nights. And one day he called me up and he says, I'm going to put you on from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And man, the calls were unbelievable. I mean, it was like I was right there. People couldn't believe it. They says, "Oh, you Spider Harrison? I was listening to you when I was in high school. Golly, I can't believe it, And sometimes I would tape it. And then they got a good production guy. Because when Donna Summer passed away, she used to live in Nashville. I did something right on the microphone, and I sent them, sent an FTP, MP3 right to him on a WAV file. And it was like I was right there, why she died, how she died, And people thought I was right there in Nashville.
So when these people call, do you take the calls?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
And do you ever reveal to them you're not really there, or do you keep that your own secret?
I got a call last night. Spider, did Tom Petty die? I said, yes. And not only that, I said he died in the same hospital as Nat King Cole, because he did. I remember when Nat King Cole died in Santa Monica, same hospital. So I was able to say that to him, and he was listening to me a little bit. And he heard, because I listen to myself. I'll have the phone. I can turn it off and TV walk around. But if I'm home, it's like I'm on from 5 p.m. to 10 here. Okay, so I go to the gym like at midnight, I'll go earlier. But if I'm here, and I'll listen to myself and do a better show the next day. They never call me, and they just says, you're unbelievable, and they keep renewing my contract, and they fly me in a couple of times a year to meet the advertisers. And I'm like a little rock star, man.
Well, you're the best judge of your skill more than anybody else listening. The other question about the taking the calls, though, is a lot of guys who were playing a predetermined set list or tracked, they would take the call, and the 14-year-old girl would say, "Would you play Miley?" And they would say, "Yeah, we'll get it on," but they have no intention of really doing that. So since you're tracked, people must call you and say, "Would you play a certain thing for me?" How do you handle that?
You know what? There has been times when that record would come on, like in the same hour.
Yeah, if you get lucky, yeah.
Yeah, I have been that lucky. But most of the time I'll says, send us an e-quest. Let us know what you want to hear.
Okay. Yeah.
Or call on the rap line. Now, when I was on from 10 to 3, I said, call the rap line, da-da-da, and they would call. And somebody at the station, I could call somebody at the station or send them an email, and they'd play the song from the station. Because all the music is played back then. All I'm doing is voice tracks.
So they might actually slip something into your show the same day.
Yeah, the program director does that. If he is mad at me sometimes he'll play the wrong record also. And that really, it's like, what is this guy doing? Is he old or what? So Tony, he'll say, not Tony, but Chris, he'll say, well, you don't want to sound too perfect,
Yeah.
So sometimes I don't even say the artist or the title. I won't. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't. But since Tony moved to Nashville, he was doing so well that he's still an executive with Federated Media, and he's the president of another organization too, of independent radio stations around the country. He moved his family to Nashville, and this is his second wife, and got a kid, and he's a young guy, and his brother's an engineer. So the owner of Federated Media says, Tony, you can make more money if you move there. You're still with this company. So he moved to Nashville. And they started making a lot of money. And now he bought a second radio station in Nashville, one that Randy Wood used to own. And I think it's the first station where Pat Boone got his records played on WHIN in Gallatin, Tennessee.
Gallatin, yes. Anything on tracking or any of this stuff? Okay. Well, then let's just hit some sort of high points or some miscellaneous things to wrap this up.
Okay.
You have mentioned a number of times you're interested in music, and you did mention a song called "Beautiful Day." You have had a record company. You've recorded some music yourself. "Beautiful Day," you mentioned, was, when I read this in researching to talk with you, was actually used in synchronization for an HBO show sometime recently, or the last few years. So you did this when you were in Indianapolis, I think, right?
Yeah, I recorded a song called "Beautiful Day" because I was thinking about "Oh Happy Day."
Yeah.
And I knew some good musicians. Wes Montgomery's daughter worked for me at my record shop. There was a lot of great musicians, a lot of talented people in Indianapolis, all over. And I told this guy named Jerry Herman, his brother was in Cincinnati, and Jerry owned the big retail store downtown Indianapolis. And they were in the record business, but retail records. And he says, I'm going to start a label called Lulu. It was his wife's name. And I said, Jerry, I want to make a record. So he says, called Beautiful Day. He says, okay, can you play it? I said, yeah.
You had written this song?
Yeah, I wrote it. I want to tell you, I wrote it. And I recorded it with some musicians in the studio. And a guy named James Boone is a great bass player. I mean, sounds like the guys on CCR, Creedence Clearwater. He was just a great bass player. So he arranged it and produced it, and I sung it. And I was able to play both sides. One side is a ballad, and Beautiful Day was caught on. And I did this, this laugh I had, and whatnot. So. And then I lost track of the song, because I could have played it when I went to Nashville. I wasn't thinking about it. And then his stores folded. He got a divorce, and Lulu Records went away. But he had the publishing and the writers, and he did it with ASCAP. But it was a lot of confusion. I didn't get any money for a long time because the Jerry Herman also wrote "Hello Dolly" for Louis Armstrong. So I finally got to somebody at BMI, and I says, I wrote the song, and I can't find Jerry Herman's airs or nothing like this. And I says,
Are you saying it's the same Jerry Herman or just someone with the same name?
same name.
But it's not that Jerry Herman of
Yeah.
Broadway.
But ASCAP could never get it together, but BMI did.
Okay.
And I finally got to the right guy at BMI, and he said, I thought this was going to be difficult, and it's not. He says, you own the song, you're the 100% of the publishers, you're 100% of the writers. And then I did a license deal with Stone Throw Records. And then they're the ones who got it licensed, an HBO movie on Entourage. I think it's episode 76 in 2007 that happened.
Well, forgive me, I don't know. Was it that well enough remembered as a song from that time that it would be synchronized in the show? Why was it used in the show? Do you know?
Well, it fit that era.
Okay.
You know, it was, it just, it was that genre at that
Yeah.
time, That makes sense? I think so.
Well, yes, I just meant with a lot of songs are from the era. Is there something about
Yeah.
that song that fit the episode specifically, I guess? Or
Yeah,
something?
the show was, I didn't see the show.
Okay.
All the stuff I've done, I've
Yeah.
seen myself on TV a couple of times as an extra. But I haven't, I've heard it, and I've seen it. It's on HBO now. I mean, if you go to the website,
Streaming,
you can see it.
yes. Well, you've also expressed in this conversation a number of times an interest in movies or in acting, and you've done some acting. You've also done some acting as a Johnny Cochran lookalike. I've seen some video of you doing this. So what is your ongoing interest in acting? What has been your acquaintanceship? You've done some commercials on television?
Yeah. Well, when I was in Nashville, I did a lot of commercials. The Bank of Cincinnati. I met the Colonel, Kentucky Fried Chicken, did a commercial with him.
You met the real Harlan Sanders.
Okay. Him.
Not John Goodman, but the real Harlan
Right,
Sanders.
right.
Yes.
And he came, and we did a Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial that's on one of my reels, and in Nashville, through Spotland Productions. And so I always wanted to do, like I said, they're all cousins, the radio, the movies, television. To me, they all are related. And you see people doing that too now. You even see Samuel Jackson singing now in a commercial.
More so now than ever, I think.
Yeah.
Across.
Yeah, it is.
Of all
And
these things.
the internet, is doing it too. So the Johnny Cochran lookalike was when I was in high school. I used to hold my nose down, and people used to say I look like Sammy Davis Jr. And I used to hold my nose down and do my little Johnny.
That's pretty good. I wouldn't have thought of Sammy Davis until you said it, but I could see, yeah.
Yeah, and then so I did when I was in high school.
Can you do the eye?
No, but right there, a guy shot me with a bow and arrow, and I almost lost an eye. I almost was Sammy Davis Jr. But I met Sammy. When I met him, he laughed, and we took pictures together. You might have seen him. I don't know. But he says, and he looked at me, Then a lot of people says, "You sure your mom?" And I said, "It was World War II. I don't know. Maybe he is my father." And I was kidding around, But anyway, the Johnny Cochran thing came later, and I didn't know who he was. And then my second wife's son-in-law says, they was talking about Michael Jackson. They says, yeah, his lawyer looked just like Spider. And I said, who's Johnny Cochran? I knew who he was. And I was working with Comcast Cable at the time. And some of the people, and I was wearing a shirt and tie every day. And I started hearing it every day. I mean, I walked down the street and people, in the gym, people were saying, it says, not only that, you even talk like the guy. And this is during the Michael Jackson thing. And then when the OJ thing hit me so bad, because I followed OJ when he was in college. And I thought it was a great thing with him and his wife, his first wife. I mean, that was great. So I didn't want to, I kind of procrastinated on being Johnny Cochran because, man, that was kind of devastating, But I did do something. I did a rap record, and a couple of guys said, what did you do that for? That's so infamous. But a lot of people liked it, especially people in Arkansas, because I was defending Bill Clinton also as a Johnny Cochran lookalike.
I saw it in preparation to talk with you, yes.
So I met Johnny Cochran, and I swear, he looked at me, I couldn't believe it. I met Johnny Cochran face to face, and then he was signing a book, and he says, who is this distinguished looking gentleman? And everybody started laughing. And I was dressed because I was doing sales too, you know. And his PR person came over and sat next to me, and she was that confused. She thought I was him. And even he said it. And that's when he says, "Be the best that you can be," because I guess he thought I was. And at that time, that's a long time ago, right? It was almost 20 years ago that happened. So I just started being me, Spider Harrison. But people say I look like Johnny Cochran. Even today they say it. But I'm not trying to look like Johnny Cochran. But I mean, if Hollywood say there's a part there. In fact, somebody at one of the luncheons says I should have got that part over Angela Batts's husband, Courtney. But he's an established actor, you know. And I always knew that. I said, if somebody do Johnny Cochran, they'd probably get somebody who looked like him or dress him up. And Finn Ream also did it too on CBS when Johnny Cochran was living, but it didn't do well. So that's how I always felt about it. And then Johnny wanted to be himself. He wanted to play himself. But then I learned more about him, that he went to L.A. high school with Dustin Hoffman. They both went to school together, you know. And I said, maybe I'll do a reunion thing and cut it off when he goes into the house and his father says, well, he called again and said, who? OJ. Then the movie ends. Because Johnny had a real active life, you know, social life, and, you know, went to a couple of marriages, and he didn't go to the March on Washington. So I think somebody can do a great movie about him, just being a personality, because he's go to nightclubs and have fun and different women and all that, you know. But he was able to keep them all together.
One more miscellaneous thing in wrapping this up, and it's a thread that's run through this entire conversation, although we haven't really spoken about it, and that is that you have talked about, you talked in the beginning of this conversation about to be success in radio, you need to be a good salesman. To be a good program director, you need to be a good salesman. You've talked about actually working as a salesman. You've talked about plugging records, and you said all the disc jockeys liked me. They would play the records I wanted them to play. So there's a running thread throughout the conversation, which is being able to build rapport with other people and being able to press the flesh and sell in the various senses of the term sell. What could you say about that? Is that a personality trait that you had from birth? Is that a skill that you acquire? What are your thoughts on salesmanship and selling in the various ways you've done it over your career, selling syndicated shows, all these things?
I think it was the people that I worked for. Like I told you, I worked in a kosher bakery. Those years in high school working in a kosher bakery with those guys, Irvin Greenberg, and I had a lot of Jewish influence from Long Island. Okay, and they told me the guys just told me a lot of things, you know, that was good for me. My sophomore year, teaching Ms. Menz, I never will forget, and I called her late in life, and she told me, she says, you don't have to be an A student to make it. She says, she saw me in class all the time. She says, persistence, endurance. Mrs. Menzen, I will never forget that lady. And I still network with some of my high school friends. We still connect. We had a little reunion in Newport Beach. They came out. And then we had the big 50th. And I didn't go to that one because it was too much drama, I think, you know. And a lot of guys had passed away, and I just didn't want to go to it, you know. And then at that time, my mother was ill. But I think it's the people that I surrounded myself, the Apollo Theater, you know, surrounded that whole circle. My father's personality, he was a bartender. He had a personality. And I used to tell people like Joe Robinson, they said, if your father was a bartender, you can't get nothing on him. And you couldn't. You know, he would tell me and my two brothers, he says, if you ever go to jail, I'm not coming that way. I mean, then my mother was the Catholic. So, you know, we had to go to Mass on Sundays and whatnot, you know. So it was a balance there. It was the people that I was associated with, the environment that I grew up in. I think Nassau County was way ahead of its time. That environment allowed me to go to Nashville to be the personality that I was, because they said that we were looking for somebody that can relate to both the black and white kids. And my father told me one thing when I went to WLAC. He says, if you're going to play rock records, he says, don't say nothing negative about white people and don't say nothing negative about black people. My father told me that. And I don't, and that was it. And you just don't. You just do your thing, man, and just, you know, and see people for their name, who they are. You know, that was it. That's one thing I forget that Frank Harrison Sr., man, he told me. I talk to my brother about that all the time. He's still in New York, you know, and My brother, the oldest brother, he don't understand the entertainment business because he went in the military. He was in Germany when we got word of my brother Johnny went to airborne. I said, "What are you doing that for?" You know, and you know, I don't like to say it, but I think I was on my way to Canada. If they would, you know, I mean, I had signed up for the Marine Corps, and then I had to go over to Whitehall Street in New York, and if I had took that test, I would have been off into the Marines. But I would have went in '62. It didn't get bad until '66, '67.
Yeah.
And I would have been coming out. But they were trying, a lot of guys, you know, went back in because it was offering them money. You know, and even my brother said, I said, what did you join the paratroopers for? He said, money. He was engaged to be married, and he never, you know. He saw my daughter. He lived to see my daughter, you know. But that was, you know, that was, I think about that, but I don't use that, you know. I mean, I just respect everything. I respect the flag. I respect people. And I don't get in conversation. That's one rule that Comcast Cable had when I was working for them. They had a rule, and I guess maybe Brian Roberts instilled that in the corporation. Don't talk about politics or religion in the workplace. Now, that came from Comcast Cable, and that's when I think Brian's father was still living. So NBC, it's NBC. I don't know if that still works, but I know it's that was said to me during the human resources when I got the job.
Well,
So, anyway.
last thing you mentioned, and I was going to ask you about this. 2015, inducted into the Tennessee Radio Hall of Fame.
Right.
For someone who spent much of his life in the Nashville market and who is working in that market remotely now, you know, any of us in creative fields, God, we like recognition. We'd love to be someone to appreciate that we did something well. So to be in a Radio Hall of Fame is really a treat. How did that come about? How did you first learn of it? And just what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Scott Shannon.
Famous name.
Yeah, Scott Shannon. I was in Nashville when he was there, and we were so dominant, he left the market. So I knew Scott, and Scott also lived in Indianapolis. And my next door neighbor here in Rancho Cucamonga was in the Army with Scott Shannon. So I got to know Scott Shannon over the years. And Scott was inducted the year before me. And then Rick Dees was also inducted. And I'm back on the air. Now people were trying to find me, you know, and there was a guy who was the general manager of one of the Clear Channel radio stations. Told me, he says, you know, people need to find out what you're going to, people are always asking about you. So really, when I went back on the air in Nashville, that's when they said, hey, it's time for Spider Harrison to be inducted. And Tony always says, it should have been done a long time ago. That's what Tony's, you know, the guy who owns the station now. So the whole station showed up. And they showed up for me and supported me. But Tony always felt it should have been done a long time ago. So I say, hey, you wait till your turn.
Where was the ceremony held, and you were there, and what were your feelings about that?
Well, my granddaughter was there because she went to Tennessee State, and her father, my daughter's first husband, got him a job there. And some of the guys that I work with, they were there. Some of the guys in the record business, the guy who introduced me to Billy Swan, I Can Help, Warren Couturier, he still lives there. And so I had a nice table. I felt real comfortable at the table I was with. And Lonnie Larden came over. You know, she was doing television in L.A. And she came to Nashville after I had left. So she said, what high school did you go to? I said, Hempstead. She said she went to Great Neck. So we kind of like knew some of the same people. So everybody came. It was nice because it was all of the old media in Nashville, television, radio. I was acknowledged by WLAC, which is now owned by Clear Channel. And they were nominated as the station of the year the same year that I was. And the general manager made a comment, hey, Spider Harrison, thank you and you guys for making WLAC what it is. So I still have, you know, some good relationships with Clear Channel, WLAC, and the Mays family. You know, I know the brothers. The father knows of me, and I met him. Yeah, I met the brothers. I don't know them that well, but I'm the kind of guy like I let things come to me. I'm not. That's not good because you you know. And then I like be quiet about the plans and loud about the results.
Yeah.
I think that's a safe thing to do and be and say.
Good point. Good point. Anything to wrap up? Well, then let's close with our obligatory question, which is, when did you become a member of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters? Who was your original sponsor? And what has the organization meant in your life?
Well, I knew about it 15 years ago. And I took a marketing class, and I met a lady by the name of Sherry McQueen. And she was working for Armed Forces Radio. And I became kind of close with the instructor, Dr. Sykes. I have a habit of that. When you get old and you go back to school, and if the instructor is nice, you know, maybe you have coffee, and et cetera. So I was really concentrating on SAG at the time, and Cher told me about the Pacific Pioneers Broadcasters.
Concentrating on SAG and becoming a member, or just your work with SAG, or what? You
No,
were
I
already a
became-
member, I'm sure, by then.
Yeah, I was concentrating on doing extra work.
Oh, doing extra
Yeah,
work. Okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
And
sorry.
I was a member.
Yeah.
And then I was talking to Cher. We were talking, so, you know, people in the class, and she thought it was interesting that I had a radio background because she saw my project, Whatever Happened To. And I was going to do that as a project, and so she started talking about Armed Forces Radio. And they had moved from Northridge to Riverside, and I think she lived in Canoga Park, and her mother moved out this way. And we started talking, and she told me about it. And I said, yeah, well, you know, I'm doing so many other things right now. And was I working with Art Astor? Because I know he was a member, and his wife was an actress. So Cher and I kept talking, and then it kept coming up. You know, it just kept coming up over the years. And I would talk to her, but I met her in a class, a marketing class, and she got to know me. And she knew the radio stations, and we would just talk on the telephone. You know, we don't see each other, you know, about it. You know, we just talk on the phone. And then I called her up one time, and I says, you know, I think I want to do something more local, Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters. And I can't think how somebody was doing voiceovers. And so I says, how did you get into the Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters? So she says, you have to have a sponsor. So I says, well, you know my career, you know my background. I'm doing radio and cable and print and everything else, and, you know, what I'm doing now. And I says, I'd never even heard of the word sponsorship. And she said it, and then she says, you got to send me your resume. And I sent her my resume and everything, and then we met at the casino for lunch. And she submitted it, and they says, I qualified. And so I said, great. So the first one I went to, Tony Orlando. And I got there late. And then I went to a second one, and I heard somebody say, Spider Harrison. And I looked, and he says, Don Graham. And I've been knowing Don Graham for years, since I first came, you know. And I couldn't believe it, you know. And then I saw, you know, how it was in the background of the people meeting Johnny Mathis, man. I said, hey, I should have been in this a long time ago. Yeah. Just to network, just to feel good about the industry.
Well, Spider Harrison, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Well, thank you so very much to everybody.